To understand the sun in the first house, we must begin by understanding the first house. The first house is defined as the place where the sun rises over the eastern horizon. So the sunrise is the basic thing that defines everything the first house symbolizes. Let's start with the concept of the sunrise being the beginning of the day. So the first house has to do with things beginning. That's why it's the house of the birth, and that's why it's considered the foundation or the core or the beginning. Since the first house represents the birth, then it also represents the thing that is born, the body, the product, the thing which has become manifest. Since the first house signifies the body is the tangible representation of the self. This is why the first house represents you, the individual, and your particular, unique, specific identity. The other thing about the sunrise, a different way of looking at beginning is this is when something becomes visible. When the sun rises, that's when you start to see. The light from the sun lets you see shapes and colors, etc. This is why it's the house that is very important for actual manifestation of results. For things to be able to become tangible, then they should be in the first house or affecting the first house or affecting the first lord somehow. And because it deals with the visible aspects of things, this is why it represents your body, and the traits or the visible aspects of the body, like what is your specific appearance, how do you behave, what's your character. Now, to understand the sun in the first house, another thing that we really need to understand is the sun. The sun symbolizes the soul. So the sun, in a very vague sense, signifies light. And consciousness is always poeticized as light. Awareness is light because light creates visibility and light grants vision. So really what the sun tangibly symbolizes here is vision and visibility. So with vision we mean clarity, focus, and visibility means the amount that you are seen by others. So in turn, this is why the sun represents public things, things which are highly visible. It is an extraversive planet, and therefore a male planet. Male comes out. So the sun signifies things which are making themselves made known, things which are manifesting and becoming visible and expressed. That has to do with the visibility aspect of light or awareness, and then the vision aspect, the ability to tell the difference between left and right, gives you a sense of clarity. Clarity gives you command. Command, the ability to say yes and no, the ability to say left, right. On the other hand, the soul also signifies the animator, like the animator also means the life force. So sun symbolizes your health. How much vitality do you have? How much life force is there? The life force and the soul is the basis for you, the self, right? The identity. So the sun signifies your ego. What kind of identity do you have? Who are you specifically? And how healthy is it? Do you have self-esteem or not? And because the self is the core that everything else revolves around and everything else defines the self is the central thing being defined by everything else in our life, the sun signifies the core, the central thing. So it's all about the centrality of something, and therefore the central thing is the stable thing. The other things orbit around it. All in all, you can boil it all down to the sun representing the boss. Sun represents the boss because it's the one who can make decisions, because it has clarity, the one who doesn't mind being seen and heard and stepping forward, the one who's the core that everybody relies on, the one who has a lot of confidence and ego and identity, etc. All right, now that we know what the sun represents and what the first house represents, we can put them side by side and see how they resonate together. What do they have in common, or where do they clash? The first thing I want to bring to your attention, which probably is pretty obvious to you, is that they both represent self. So the sun in the first house symbolizes having a lot of self. And we can express that in this one word of pride. The sun in the first house is a symbol of pride. Now, when you have a planet in a house, the exact interpretation that you want to give to it depends upon the circumstances of the planet. So when you think about generically, like what does the sun in the first house represent, make sure you try to think in the spectrum. You think of a basic concept like pride, but then try to remember that there's a spectrum of what pride can mean. So for example, a sun in the first house in a very healthy condition with nice aspects that it likes and conjunctions with planets that it likes and in signs that it likes, that signifies good pride. What do we mean by good pride? It means like self-confidence, self-esteem. But a sun in the first house in a sign it doesn't like, or with aspects from planets it doesn't like, etc., that signifies bad pride. You're proud. It means you have self-importance, or you refuse to cooperate with other people. Another thing about sun in first house that's pretty obvious is that the sun is all about visibility, and the first house is all about visibility. And so when the sun is in the first house, you expect a lot of visibility. So in a word, we can say prominence. But again, think of this on a spectrum. If the sun is doing really well in the first house, then prominence means leadership. But if the sun is doing poorly in the first house, it's more like dominance. If the sun is doing well in the first house, prominence means somebody that inspires followers, somebody that inspires loyalty. If the sun is in the first house in a bad condition, it means somebody that demands loyalty and expects it. So is kind of lazy and expects other people to do things for them. If the sun is in the first house in a good state, then prominence means they can take care of themselves. So that means like self-sufficient and disciplined and self-contained and self-controlled. But if the sun is in the first house in a bad state, then that means intolerance, uber strictness, unforgivingness. And it's not just that simple actually as whether the sun is good or whether the sun is bad. It's also the type of goodness or badness. So the sun might be in a type of condition that highlights unforgivingness, even though it may not necessarily be all bad. So you can get a mix. Some of the good traits of the sun in the first house can come out, but some particular bad traits. Another thing about the sun and the first house is that they both have to do with health, the body and how healthy it is. So if the sun is in the first house, we expect a lot of health. If it's doing good in the first house and the person is healthy, then especially in the sense of having vitality, having fire. If the sun is not doing well in the first house, then they will have problems with too much energy, too much acid, too much bile. And this is related to actually just the simple fact that the planet in the first house has its traits amplified. So when the sun is affecting your physical traits, you have a pitta body type. A pitta body type means a lot of metabolism. So generally you're going to find people that are thinner, maybe lean. The hair is not really thick. The hair is light and fluffy, maybe thin. And the body has a yellowishness to it, and the eyes are not particularly brightly white. And so sun in the first house in bad situations or in situations which overly accentuate the acidity can have damage upon the hair and the eyes. Now that we have a pretty clear theory about what the sun in the first house is all about, let's look at some famous people with the sun in the first house and see how this might make sense. So first of all, have a look at Gandhi. Gandhi is sun in the first house in Libra. Whoa, this is really funny actually how prominent this is. Pride, right? Pride in a negative sense was non-cooperation. That was Gandhi. Gandhi is defined as the civil disobedience movement. Civil disobedience. So that is his thing. That is his trademark, was disobedience, which is what you would expect from the sun debilitated in the first house. But how come he's famous and revered, etc., for his civil disobedience? Well, there's a lot of other things in the chart which are quite nice. One hallmark of his chart is the exact mutual opposition between Jupiter and Mars. That's famous for giving people who kind of have a religious following, who have kind of like a religious flavor to them, actually. He also, that particular Jupiter influence on Mars is also influencing his Venus and Mercury, and that whole combination of Venus, Mercury, Mars makes two Raja Yogas. Another person with the sun in the first house is Vivekananda. Vivekananda, maybe less famous than Gandhi, but Vivekananda was the first actual Hindu sadhu to represent Hinduism in the West. You may notice that he doesn't really look like Gandhi. Gandhi has the trademark of being lean and thin, but Vivekananda is kind of plump, and also you can notice he has good hair and he has big eyes. So what you want to pay attention to is the fact that he's got Venus in his first house as well. Think about the situation here of the two being in Capricorn. Venus is happier. Venus is in a friend sign in Capricorn, Sun is in an enemy sign in Capricorn. So Venus kind of defines Vivekananda more than the Sun. But still, you find a leader, a very prominent person that was not afraid to step forward, step out of bounds. Not only was it the first time that the West admitted an actual sadhu from the East, from India, to come forward, but actually India was insular. A sadhu was not supposed to go to the West to explain to these people what these things are, because they're not qualified to learn that. But he broke out of that, went out into new boundaries, etc. Another person with the sun in the first house is Caitlyn Jenner. So she's kind of different than Gandhi and Vivekananda. What Gandhi and Vivekananda really have in common that gives them both that similar flavor is they both have the Jupiter-Mars mutual aspect, whereas Caitlyn Jenner doesn't. So with Caitlyn Jenner, what do you see from the sun in the first house? Well, a person who's very prominent, celebrity type person. Also a person that's athletic. So lean, muscular, athletic, healthy. A self-confidence or self-esteem that gives her the ability to put herself out there in a vulnerable position. Yet it's the sun in Scorpio in the first house. So it's kind of this mixed bag. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. So I hope that gives you a clear grasp of the sun in the first house, in theory, how it operates, and then also in practice in a couple of charts of well-known people. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you catch everything in the series. Watch all the playlists that are on my channel page, and I'll see you next time. Okay, now we're going to explore what the sun in the second house means and have a look at how it manifests in some specific charts. We'll use 3 people: Priyanka Chopra, Stephen King, and Candy Barr. So let's get started by a quick recap of what the second house symbolizes. As you can see, it is physically the area of the sky that's just below the eastern horizon, and that is what it symbolizes. Below the eastern horizon means like the foundation or support for the sunrise. And that's the basis of the second house. It supports the sunrise. Whatever the sunrise symbolizes, the second house is favorable to that. So for example, the sunrise symbolizes the beginning of things. So the second house is all about things which are pro-beginning, which help us do things, which help us start things. So this is why it's the house of the foundations, the preparations, the prerequisites. And this is why it symbolizes stability or having strong foundation. Similarly, it's the house of family because family is what gives birth to us. It starts us, right? And it signifies all of the supporters and friends who help us do things. Furthermore, on this theme, the second house signifies wealth because wealth is like the capital that we need to make an enterprise, to do something. What we need to be able to start an endeavor is wealth or health. So the second house symbolizes also nutrition, how we get our health. Another thing about the sunrise is that it causes things to become visible. So the second house is also pro-visibility. And that means making things known or having knowledge. And also it means knowability or tangibility or real practical things. Now that was a good recap of what the second house represents. Let's do a similar quick recap for what the sun represents before we go on to talk about the sun in the second house. So the basis for the sun's symbolism is the idea of soul. That's what the sun is really all about, the soul. One aspect of soul is that this is the animus or the source of our consciousness or awareness. And this is why the sun represents awareness, which is signified by light. Light that makes you aware of things, right? So light brings vision and also visibility. On the concept of visibility, this is why the sun signifies visible things, public things. It's the extraverse, the visible world, and it's the extraverse of gender, the male gender, the gender which comes out. On the concept of light bringing vision, vision means clarity. Clarity means the ability to make decisions. And this is why the sun represents command, leadership ability, authority. Another thing about the soul is that it's the source of our vitality and life. So this is why the sun represents health and vitality. But also, the source of our life is like the focal point for our sense of self. So the sun represents the self in terms of how we define ourselves, what is our identity, what is our ego, like our pride and our esteem, self-esteem and things like that. And because the focal point for the self is the central point for life, the sun represents the central point of things, the core of things. And hence it's the stabilizer of things or the pin around which everything else revolves. All in all, it represents the central figure, the most important figure, the most authoritative figure, so we can say it represents the boss or the king. Okay, now all of our foundations are done. We understand the sun and the second house. Let's talk about how they vibe together. What happens if you put the sun in the second house? One thing which we should mention first is that there's kind of a incompatibility between the sun and the second house. And it is on the basis that the sun is a very public thing, but the second house is a private place. It's a place for family. So with the sun and the second house, you get the signification of non-domesticability, indomesticability, untamability. And the natives tend to be more enthusiastic about their career than they are about their family, or they would put their career first. They would sacrifice the family's interests for the interests of the career, etc. And also on the same theme, the privacy of the second house clashing with the publicity of the sun. They kind of favor publicity at the expense of their own privacy. So this is one issue with the sun in the second house. The other things that I want to mention about the sun in the second house are favorable. The sun, for example, is the core, right? It signifies stability, and the second house is foundations. It signifies stability. So with the sun in the second house, you get a stabilized person. You get a very consistent person. And it will mostly pertain to what they really care about, which is career and publicity. So they'll be very consistent in their work. They'll be very consistent at their job, or at least in their chores. And the third thing, which is very important to mention and understand about the sun in the second house, is that there's another nice vibe or synergistic vibe between the sun representing health and the second house representing health. So a person with the sun in the second house should be healthy. And that means strong, not ill, and it also means looks. The health affects the appearance, so they should look good. Now, let's get to the really interesting part. Let's see how this theory about the sun in the second house actually manifests in practical, real charts. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we'll use three subjects who are famous who have the sun in the second house: Priyanka Chopra, Candy Bar, and Stephen King. Let's first of all look at the concept that the sun in the second house makes you a non-domestic person or an untamable person, putting career before family, publicity before privacy. Definitely three of these people fit that mold, but not all of them in the same exact way. Let's ask this question. Does this really describe Priyanka Chopra? Not really. Of course, quite a bit, because she's a celebrity. So that just goes without saying that you sacrifice your privacy for your publicity, and you sacrifice your private life, which means family life, for the interest of the career. But it's not really over the top in Priyanka Chopra. Why is that? One very obvious reason why is because she has a house exchange between the first and the second houses. She has Mercury, the first lord, in Cancer, the second house, and she has Moon, the second lord, in Gemini, the first house. So the second house, therefore, is quite important to Priyanka Chopra, which means she values family. That's why it doesn't go over the top. Additionally, she has Venus, the fifth lord, in the first house. So that means love, relationships are very important to her. So although she has Sun in the second house, she will have some of these traits of non-domestic ability, but they're not really pronounced. On the other hand, if we ask the same question of how well this matches Candy Bar, we think it matches her a lot. I mean, very much. So why? Well, she has the first lord in the first house, which is very me-ish. She has the seventh lord in the sixth house, which is not very favorable to partnership and relationships. And she has Saturn in the 10th house, which means unashamedness. So it's really emphasizing the ability to be public. Furthermore, she has a very high sex drive because Mars in Libra from the 5th house is aspecting Ketu in Capricorn in the 8th house. Now, interestingly, Priyanka Chopra has something very similar. She has Mars in Libra in the 5th house aspecting a node, the opposite node, Ketu in Capricorn in the 8th house. Not as strongly, and it's the opposite node. So that alone goes a long way to explaining the difference between the sexiness of Candy Bar versus the sexiness of Priyanka. Now, thirdly, let's see about Stephen King's non-domestic putting career. Yeah, kind of, but not really in terms of his actual marriage. So you notice with him, like Priyanka Chopra, he has the first lord in the second house. So the second house is important to him. And additionally, he has the seventh lord in the first house. So he's submitting to the partner. So again, although it's a yes, of course, this looks like Stephen King, but it's not really pronounced for Stephen King. Let's move on to the next point about the sun in the second house, which is a consistent worker, a hard worker, a person with a work ethic. How about Priyanka? Very much. Why so much? Well, besides having the sun in the second house, she has an exalted Saturn, the planet of work. Candy Bar? Is she a consistent, reliable worker? Extremely, very. Candy Bar went out to her job, which was stripping, but she went out to her job on the same day that she was released from jail, having been arrested for shooting her husband, who barged into her house against her will or against the law or something. Or that's how much of a consistent, reliable worker she was. And why? Again, same thing. She has a very prominent Saturn. It's not exalted like Priyanka, but it's in the 10th house alone. And Saturn is the planet for work, so it's assisting implication of the sun in the second house. That's the point. If something else in your chart assists the implication of something else, then it becomes stronger. If nothing else in your chart assists or reinforces the interpretation of something, then it doesn't become strong at all. So Candy Bar has the sun in the second house, which means a consistent worker, and she has Saturn prominent in the 10th house, which means a consistent worker. So it's really the case for her. Stephen King, of the three, the most work-oriented person of these three. Why so much? Not only does he have Saturn in the first house, but his Saturn is his sixth lord. So he has the sixth lord as Saturn in the first house. Finally, let's take a look at this third trait, which we expect, which is to be healthy, which means strong and good-looking. Is Priyanka Chopra good-looking? That's an easy question to answer. She's extremely good-looking. Why so much? Because besides having the sun in the second house, she has the moon and Venus in the first house, which is Gemini. So she has a beautiful sign with two beautiful planets in the first house and happens to have the sun in the second. How about Candy Bar? Is she beautiful? Obviously she's beautiful. Otherwise she wouldn't be the first modern, sex symbol. What about her? She has Gemini rising and Mercury is in Gemini. First lord is in the first house. And Mercury is a beautiful planet. How about Mr. King? I apologize, but that's not really Mr. King's strong point. He's a writer. He's not a model or even an actor. So he doesn't really look very handsome or healthy or anything like that. Why not? He has the sun in the second house. Yes, but he doesn't have Mercury and Gemini in the first house or the Venus and Moon and Gemini in the first house. What does he have in his first house? He has Saturn in his first house. And how is Saturn doing there? It's not so happy. It's in Leo. So I hope this has helped you to get a grasp not only for how to work out the basic theory of a planet like the sun in a house like the second house, but also see the theory and operation behind how you use a basic interpretation in an actual chart by contrasting it with the rest of the things. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. In this video, I'm going to go over the implications of the sun being in the third house. And we'll have a look at how it actually manifests or doesn't manifest in three real charts. One for Oprah Winfrey, another for Anton LaVey, and the third will be an unknown person, an anonymous chart. To begin understanding the sun in the third house, let's quickly review what the third house is all about. As you can see in this depiction, the third house is part of the lower quadrant of the sky. It's under the ground, but it's on the eastern side. So the underground has a certain signification. It signifies the internal part of our being. And the east has a certain signification. It's associated with sunrise, which means manifesting and becoming tangible, becoming real. So the third house being the eastern border of the underground portion of the sky. So it's all about expressing and manifesting what we have inside, expressing the interior. And the first river of meaning that we want to float down is the concept of assertion. Expressing the interior means asserting yourself. And so this is why the third house signifies strength, the ability to assert, the ability to exert force, and have an impact on things and make a difference. Another way to say this is that it has to do with our power. And that's related to not just the raw force of the power, but the skill. How able are we to act upon our desires and motivations? How able are we to express what we want? And thirdly, the assertiveness leads to contest or competition. And so the third house shows our ability to compete and contest and win. So it has a lot to do with sports and athletics and war and fighting. People that we have conflicts with. And who do we have conflict with? Not our juniors, not our seniors, but with our peers, our siblings. So the third house represents the peers and siblings as well. Now, another river that branches off of this basic theme of expressing the interior is the concept of will. This is why the third house depicts the person's decision-making ability, their ability to be decisive. And that directly impacts how much confidence a person has. How confidently do they say yes or no? How confident are they in the answers that they give? How confident are they in their decisions? And how much do they stick by them? So the third house shows the discipline or tenacity of will. It also shows the volume of will. How much will is there? How ambitious is the person? So another way to say that is how lusty or how hungry they are. And finally, will is the expression of I. It's the expression of what I want. So the third house shows a self-focus. How self-focused are we? How important is our will? How important is our desire? How important are our decisions to us? And hence, it is not really a house which lends to cooperation or subordination at all. It's a house that lends to defiance, or at least independence and individuality. Well, that was the third house. Now, before we talk about the sun in the third house, let's do a quick review of what the sun is all about. Essentially, the sun symbolizes soul. And soul basically means the quantum of awareness or consciousness. The reason why the sun signifies this is because it's bright, and brightness or light is what enables awareness or perception. So the sun literally signifies light, and light enables vision and visibility. So the sun is very much about vision and visibility. In terms of visibility, the sun signifies how visible you are. How public are you? How extroverted are you? How masculine are you? How willing are you to go out and adventure in the world? And on the concept of the light being vision, it enables vision. Vision means you have a plan. And to enforce your vision means you give commands, you tell people to go a certain way. So the sun signifies commands, order giving, authority, leadership. Besides being the quantum of awareness, the soul is also the essence of what life is. Awareness is the essence of what life is. So saying that the sun represents the soul means that it represents life force. And this is why the sun symbolizes our basic health, the amount of vitality that we have. And since the soul and our life is the focal point or the center point for our being, the sun represents our being, our self. So it has to do with our ego, our identity, our self-esteem. And again, since the self is the core of who and what we are, that's what the sun represents. The core of things, the central things, the stabilizing point. So all in all, the sun represents the soul, and also we can say the king or the boss. Because the boss or the king is the commander, the public, the visible face, the leader, the one who gives the vision, the one who's the most visible, the one who gives the life force to the project, the one who is the identity of the project, and the one who is the core stabilizer of the project. Now we're caught up about what the sun symbolizes and what the third house symbolizes. We can easily discuss what the sun in the third house represents now. All that we really need to do is compare the two symbolic trees and see where they are alike or directly different. In the case of the sun in the third house, the sun and the third house are very similar in their nature. The sun is public, and this third house wants to make the private things public. So when you have the sun in the third house, it indicates a person who is able to be bold, able to be public, able to be forthright and outgoing. So we can describe them as heroic. We can say that they're fearless. They're not timid. They're daring. We can say that they're strong or effective. They're impactful. They will have a leadership capacity to them. And so they'll be attractive in the way of being charismatic and compelling. And they will be a source of energy or motivation or compulsion for others. They will compel others, impel others, motivate others. So they kind of feel like a power plant that gives off energy that other people can use. Secondly, the sun was about the self, and the third house is a self-focused house. And therefore, we expect people with the sun in the third house to be self-okay, self-sufficient, self-motivating. They don't need other people to inspire them. They're already inspired. They have their own lusts. They have their own plans. They have their own desires. They don't need your blueprint. They don't need your wake-up call. Self-establishing. They don't need your ratification. They don't need your approval. They approve themselves. They establish themselves. They do their own work. And non-conformist or unorthodox. They don't need your blueprint. They'll do it their way. So the sun in the third house is quite good at being a leader because the self is very self-contained and competent and isn't afraid to go forth and dominate. Thirdly, the sun is about commanding, and the third house is all about decision-making. So giving commands, giving orders, making decisions. So we can describe this person as being dominant or influential. They take the lead, they are dominant, they make things go the way they want them to go. They establish their vision and they make sure that it happens that way. That is the theory of what the sun in the third house signifies. Now, let's put the theory into practice and look at the sun in the third house in 3 real charts of real people. We have Oprah Winfrey, Anton LaVey, and an anonymous person. First, we said that the sun in the third house represents a heroic, fearless, effective, charismatic, motivational person. Does that match Oprah Winfrey? Super matches Oprah Winfrey. Especially the last part of being like an energy source or a motivational source for other people, but also, if you investigate her early life, very fearless, very daring, very intent on doing her thing. So, why is it such a clear and strong match for Oprah Winfrey? Well, one thing quite important is that her sun in the third house is also in a Raja Yoga. And it's in a Raja Yoga with the 10th Lord. So that's really empowering this ability to be a big public figure and a big leader figure and a big source of motivation for others. Secondly, her Mars is aspecting her sun in the third house. Mars and the third house are very similar in what they represent. So her sun in the third house is also getting an extra dose of third house-ishness by virtue of being aspected by Mars. Not only that, but her third lord, Saturn, is with Mars. So Mars is really keeping an eye on the third house, really enabling it to have that power that it's supposed to have. And the final thing that I want to say about Oprah's chart that makes it really able to show this potential of the sun in the third house is that her first house is very good. Because anything about the strength of the self and self-confidence and being a leader cannot come to fruition if the first house isn't also similarly strong. Because the first house represents the self. So why is Oprah's first house so strong? Well, first of all, the first lord has a strong aspect on it. And when the lord aspects a house, that house prospers. And secondly, incidentally, besides this very important point, it's also hosting a moon being aspected by Jupiter, which is very positive. So Oprah Winfrey really matches this well. Let's have a look at the second example chart. Anton LaVey. Is he heroic, fearless, daring, strong, effective, charismatic, motivational type leader? Yeah, very. He started a new religion. Why? Well, first thing that catches your eye is the sun is not only in the third house, but it's exalted and all by itself. In fact, Anton LaVey is a very masculine type third house leader. And this exalted sun in the third house all by itself really depicts that well. Secondly, just like Oprah, where there's a lot of martial influence in the chart as well, he has it also by virtue of his moon being opposite to Mars. And like Oprah Winfrey had a solid first house, he does too. Not quite as openly or mainstreamly solid, but solid nonetheless by virtue of his first lord being in its own sign. And the reason why I say not as mainstream of a solidity is because it's in the 12th house. So his stuff is going more to mystical or weird stuff because his moon aspected by Mars is in the 8th house and his first lord in its own sign is in the 12th house. And so within that field of mysticism, which is a background context of the chart, he has a strong self-focus, which is really the essence of his whole religion that he called Satanism, but doesn't really have to do with Satan. It has to do with selfishness. Selfism. And finally, the anonymous chart. This is the chart of a person who is not really a heroic leader, but has that quality somewhere in them. And it's noticeable, but it doesn't really shine in the person. This person does have the aspect of Mars to the 3rd house, much like Oprah did. However, it's her Mars is in a Mercury sign, and her Sun in the 3rd house is in a Mercury sign. Compare that to Oprah, whose Sun in the 3rd house is in a Saturn sign, and whose Mars aspecting it is in its own sign. So she does have an aspect of Mars to her Sun in the 3rd house, but it's not really carrying the same punch that it does with Oprah Winfrey. That's a point of discussion, but it's still not really right on the pulse of what's going on with this chart. Coming closer to the pulse, you might notice that the Sun is very close to Venus, which means that it's swallowing or combusting a debilitated planet. So it's weakening by that. Thirdly, getting right to the pulse of what the problem is with this chart in terms of why does the Sun in the 3rd house not produce a self-confident leader. It's because of her first house. Her first house is Cancer and it has Saturn in it. So that signifies a lot of self-negativity and self-doubt and a feeling of weakness. And that self-negativity, that self-doubt, has a direct influence upon the 3rd house and the 3rd lord. So in this case, the fate of the interpretation of the Sun in the 3rd house hinges on the fact that Saturn in the 1st house from Cancer is aspecting it very strongly. Okay, now let's take a look at another quality of the Sun in the 3rd house. It's supposed to be self-sufficiency, right? Self-motivating, self-establishing, etc. Nonconformist. Does Oprah match this description? Yes, but except unorthodox. She's not really that unorthodox. She's pretty mainstream. Why? Well, she has a very orthodox first house. She has Sagittarian first house being aspected by Jupiter and hosting a moon which is in a mutual aspect with Jupiter. So both of those things indicate a strong tendency to respect accepted sources of wisdom. Hence, although she's very self-motivating and self-establishing, she's not exactly nonconformist. Whereas the second chart, Anton LaVey, he's off the hook. He's super nonconformist. This whole reason for choosing Satan as a symbolism was its nonconformist shock value. So why is it that he's so extremely nonconformist? Well, look at what's going on in his 4th house. It's kind of like, if you're really good with astrology, you'll recognize this as the polar opposite of what we just talked about with Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey had the moon mutually aspected with Jupiter. What Anton LaVey has is the 9th lord directly conjoined Rahu. And to add a little bit more icing to the cake, the 9th lord is directly conjoined Rahu and the 8th lord. So here's a Rahuvian philosopher. This person's religiousness is very Rahuvian. Now, as for the 3rd chart, Is this person self-motivating, self-establishing, nonconformist, etc.? Kind of with the nonconformity, yes. But really, on all of these cases, it's again another issue of they try to be, but they don't quite make it. And for the nonconformity thing, this third chart has a lot of similarity to Oprah's chart because it has the conjunction of Moon and Jupiter. And now that our attention is directed to the Moon, we might even think, but wait, she's got the Moon in Aries, so this person should be kind of bold, shouldn't she? But even that Moon in Aries has a lot of aspect from Saturn in the first house. And so again, it comes down to the Saturn and Cancer in the first house. You can't really expect this chart to represent a person who's very self-motivated or getting themselves out of bed, getting themselves on their schedule, getting themselves on their program, getting themselves to follow their desires. Because of all the self-doubt and self-negativity, I don't think I can do it. So why even try? So all the sources of the things that should be making a person individually self-contained and independent and bold, the third house and the Moon in Aries, are being impacted by Saturn being in Cancer in the first house. Finally, the third trait of the Sun in the third house is kind of the same really as the other ones. Influential, taking the lead, establishing their vision, etc. Oprah Winfrey, extremely. Why? We already discussed all the same reasons. Anton LaVey, extremely. Why? Same reasons as what we already discussed. And this third person, influential, establishing the vision, yes, but on a small scale. And not so consistently, even on that small scale. Why is there weakness in this third chart? For all the same reasons that we already described. So, I think now you have a clear picture of what the Sun in the third house signifies and what kind of conditions in the chart can support what the Sun in the third house signifies versus what kind of conditions in the chart can deny what the Sun in the third house signifies. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. To understand the Sun in the fourth house, we must first understand the fourth house. So let's take a quick moment to review what the fourth house is all about. As you can see in this diagram, the fourth house physically is the area of the sky that is the most directly under your feet. It's underground. And that is why it symbolizes what it symbolizes. It symbolizes things which are below the surface or interior. And so it's all about the inner self. This is why it is the house that is about our emotions. What is the main emotion that we seek? Happiness and mental health. So the fourth house shows our happiness or the health and goodness of our emotions. The actual path to happiness is through devotion. See, you don't get emotion without devotion to something. And the fourth house symbolizes that archetypical person who is the most devoted, which is the mother. And femininity in general. Another thing that the inner self means is the private self, the part of the self that the world doesn't really see. So the fourth house has to do with privacy. This is why it shows our shyness or modesty. And this is why it deals with our home, the place where we go where we're alone and the public doesn't see us there. And that's why it has to do also with property, private things that we own or that we enjoy ourselves, we keep to ourselves. And finally, what do you do in home? You sleep. Or what do you do when you're not active? You sleep. What do you do when you go inside yourself and dream? You sleep. So the fourth house has to do with sleep and things like sleep, quietness, peacefulness. Finally, below ground also has to do with the roots. And so the fourth house symbolizes the roots of things and therefore their stability or the strength of their foundation and what they come from. And so it's the fourth house showing the mother also shows the parental ancestry and therefore the cultural background of the person. Now, to understand the sun in the fourth house, we also need to make sure we understand the sun. So let's also just take a quick second to review what the sun symbolizes. Fundamentally, the sun signifies the soul, and the soul is what? The soul is the source of consciousness or awareness. Why does the sun symbolize the soul? Because it's light. It produces light, and light enables awareness or perception. So the sun symbolizes light. Light makes things visible and enables vision. So because the sun is all about visibility, it signifies publicness, fame, extroversiveness, how you're showing things to the world, and maleness. And because the sun has to do with vision, sun has to do with light has to do with vision has to do with your leadership ability, your command, how you take authority, how you tell people what to do. The soul is also the essence of a thing. So the sun also represents a person's identity. This is why it represents the self, their ego, their sense of identity, and also the quality of their sense of self, their self-esteem. And this is also why the sun represents the essence or the core of anything. And that's why it has to do with being the central or the most important thing or the stabilizing thing, the thing which is constant. Finally, the soul also provides life force. Like that is the life force. The life force is the awareness and the identity. So sun also represents life force, and that's why it signifies your health and vitality. And guess what? Now we are prepared to talk directly about how to interpret the sun in the fourth house. First, let's do it theoretically, and then let's look at it in real charts. So one thing you might have noticed is that the sun is visible, but the underground fourth house is invisible. So there's a clash between the sun being very public, but the fourth house being private. And the interpretation is that the sun in the fourth house signifies a sacrifice of privacy, or a loss of privacy, or a diminishing of the importance of privacy. The natives with the sun in the fourth house expect them to be willing or even eager to sacrifice their private life in exchange for something social or public. Probably also notice that the sun is masculine, but the fourth house is feminine. And so things related to masculine and feminine also clash. So you get extroverted sun in an introverted fourth house. You get a dominating and commanding sun in a shy and modest fourth house. So all that clash adds up to an interpretation which is difficult to put into words, but let's say complex presentation. There's a complex presentation of these dichotomies: male, female, introverted, extroverted, commanding, but shy. So the natives are passively dominant. They're very complex in how they dominate. They are sacrificing their privacy for their public. Therefore, they also feel intense need for privacy. And this is kind of an attractive, volatile mixture, especially understood by the mixing of male and female together and putting a male planet in a female house. It can be very charismatic. It's sexy. There's one more important thing about the sun in the fourth house, and here's a way in which the sun and the fourth house are similar. You may have noticed it. The sun is stability because it's the core, the central thing, the reliable thing. And the fourth house is the foundation. So there is one thing about the sun in the fourth house which is very easy to go well, to interpret well. It's the sense of stability or a constancy to the person. Their beliefs and their concepts are constant. Let's now look at the sun in the fourth house in 3 example charts. We have a chart of Sri Krishna, we have a chart of Elizabeth Taylor, and we have the chart of Joseph Goebbels. 3 well-known people with the sun in the fourth house. And let's take each one of those 3 interpretations and see how the theory of that interpretation holds up in these actual charts. So the first thing we said was that the public sun is clashing with the private fourth house, so we should have a person who is willing to sacrifice or driven to sacrifice their privacy for some kind of a public goal. So in Krishna's case, is this true? It's very true. Krishna constantly is sacrificing his personal comforts and his family setting for some kind of a social need. So first of all, immediately upon birth, he's separated from his parents for 16 years. Then he develops a new family with this foster parents, so-called foster parents, and friends, very intimate friends, dear friends, uncles, aunts, grandmas, grandpas, for 16 years in Vrindavan. And then when he's discovered by the king there, he has to leave that for their sake. And he has to go. And then again, he has to leave Dwarka. He has to leave Mathura again to go to Dwarka. So you could even say a third time he had to do that. And then often he has to leave Dwarka to go to Hastinapur. So you can even say like 4 or 5 times. Like he's constantly sacrificing that kind of personal comfort, personal relationships for some kind of social good or higher good. So the reason why in his case this is kind of like a noble thing, and it doesn't lose the fourth house qualities of being devotional or something. It's not like a hard-hearted way that he's doing that. It's a very noble way that he's doing it. The reason is that his sun in the fourth house is in Leo. So it's the fourth lord in the fourth house. So it's strengthening the fourth house. That's also why he develops very strong personal comfort, very strong personal relationships, very strong inner domestic situations quickly. And that fourth lord in the fourth house additionally is being aspected by an exalted planet from the 9th house, Mars. Now, let's think about Elizabeth Taylor. Is she a person who sacrifices privacy for publicity? Of course. And she did so very successfully. So let's see, why was she so successful in achieving fame? Her sun in her fourth house is the 9th lord. So similar to Krishna, there's a connection between 9 and 4. Furthermore, her fourth lord, Jupiter, is in the 9th house, Leo. So what she has is a parivartana yoga, a house exchange between these 2 very auspicious houses, 4 and 9. And that, by combining 4 and 9, that causes a Raj Yoga. So her sun in the fourth house is in parivartana Raj Yoga. And that fourth lord is aspecting the first house. And is the first lord aspecting the first house. So it makes a lot of sense that this chart is super strong and fortunate in that context of being a very strong, powerful, fortunate person. The concept of sun in the fourth house sacrificing privacy for publicity works well. You can't really get any good effects if the first house isn't really strong. And that is the case with her. She has her first lord involved in this Raj Yoga with the fourth house aspecting the first house. Krishna also has his first lord in a Raja Yoga in its own sign with an exalted planet. And Elizabeth Taylor has this other factor of Mercury, her 10th lord, being Kazimi, which is the point in combustion, which is exact conjunction with the sun, even by declination, which really empowers the sun to fully take the qualities of the planet. And so the 10th lord is really giving itself to the sun. How about Joseph Goebbels? Joseph Goebbels is the Nazi second in line to Hitler. So is he going to sacrifice fourth house things for public things? Very much. But in his case, it's like sacrificing the compassion of the fourth house for political ends and ideals. Also the tragic way in which he killed his children at the end. Like his position as the chancellor or whatever of Nazi Germany forced him to have to kill his children and kill himself and his wife. So that's also really strongly sacrificing the fourth house things because of political stuff. So why is it so brutal in his case, whereas with Elizabeth Taylor and with Krishna, they're feminine people and they're devotional people? Well, Joseph Goebbels, his son in the fourth house, is in a very martial setting. It's in Scorpio, which belongs to Mars, and it's with Mars. So Mars is in Scorpio, really getting strong. It's really having a lot of impact on the sun. It's dominating the sun. The second thing is that his first house is super dominated by Ketu, which is a very intense interpretation. And on top of that, his second lord, Mercury, is combusted by the sun. So he's not getting any devotion or anything from his second lord either. Whereas if you look at the second lord for Krishna's chart, it's exalted in the fifth house. Second lord for Elizabeth Taylor's chart, it's Mool Trikon. It's in its own sign in the third house. But Joseph Goebbels is in an enemy sign with an enemy and combust. Now let's take a look at the second principle of the sun in the fourth house. And this is that complicated one about the masculine-feminine clash and how it presents a person who's passively dominant, non-disclosing, and attractive in a complex way. Does this match Krishna? It super matches Krishna because he's extremely feminine and extremely beautiful, yet also a powerful king. So it's a very complex mixture of masculine and feminine things. Also, he's quite non-disclosing. Most of the time, he's invisible, and for a blink of an eye, he's visible as an avatar. And passively dominant, he does not really express his power in anybody's face. Yet, he's the most powerful being. So what is it about Krishna's chart that's really enhancing this potential of the sun in the fourth house to be complex in this way? Well, the main thing that should really pop out right away is he has a Taurus moon, an exalted Taurus moon on his ascendant. So that is really going to support femininity, beauty, etc. So what the sun might be indicating and taking away from the fourth house is being given by the second lord being exalted and the moon being exalted on the ascendant. Secondly, both his first lord and his moon are in association with gender neutral planets. So the first lord, Venus, is in Libra with Saturn. Saturn is gender neutral. And the ascendant is with Ketu, and the moon is also with Ketu. And Ketu is also gender neutral. So you're going to have a being who is androgynous. And then the sun in the fourth house really enhances that. And finally, fundamentally, his sun in the fourth house is there in a very good condition. It's in its own sign, and it's getting an auspicious aspect from an exalted planet, from a good house. Now, how about Elizabeth Taylor? Is she attractive? She's very attractive. She very much matches this concept. So why is that? When you have the first lord in a Raja Yoga in the ninth house, aspecting the ascendant, you know the person is very beautiful. The sun in the fourth house giving that kind of sexual charisma is now just going to add to that. Secondly, both of her female planets are in Mars signs. So she has Venus in Aries and she has the moon in Scorpio. When you take female planets and put them in Mars signs, you're doing the same thing as putting the sun in the fourth house. You're mixing the masculine and feminine. And what that does in a female native is makes them bold, makes them daring, makes them attractive. They challenge the male. They taunt the attraction out from the male. How about Joseph Goebbels? Well, yes on the thing of passively dominant and no on the thing of being very pretty or handsome. So why is that? First of all, let me explain why I say yes on the passive dominance thing. Joseph Goebbels was like a devotee. Yet it was one of the most brutal people that ever existed. So he was highly devotional and was, throughout his early life, just searching for the object of his devotion. So what about his chart tells us that? Well, he's got Venus in Libra, so he's highly devotional. But it kind of stops there, and it's more like the brutality of sacrificing the fourth house for the masculine principle. Sacrificing the feminine for the masculine means sacrificing softness and forgiveness and love and acceptance and cooperation for some kind of a principle or a rule or a stricture or an ideal. Because his sun in the fourth house, first of all, appears in the context of a Ketu-dominated chart, highly dominated by Ketu. And second of all, doesn't get any benefic influence. That means that the first house, because the sun is the first lord, that means that the first house is not getting much or any benefic influence, a little bit from Mercury, and the ascendant itself is not getting any benefic influence. So compared to Elizabeth Taylor, which is hugely influenced by Jupiter from the ninth house, and compared to Krishna, which is usually influenced by the moon in the first house, this man has no femininity supporting him, except for that Venus, where it doesn't really even belong in the third house. And this is also why he's not particularly good looking, even though the rest of these people were, Elizabeth Taylor and Krishna. Although we may say he's not good looking, he must have been charismatic. Look at him speaking here. He's a huge speaker. He's a people rouser. People followed him, but it had nothing to do with his looks. To get good looks, you need benefic influence on the first house and the first lord. And now the final trait that we expect from the sun in the fourth house has to do with stability, especially in the consistency of one's beliefs and internal concepts and feelings. Does that match Krishna very much? And Krishna is the establisher of consistent philosophical systems. He's the speaker of Bhagavad Gita, and the Bhagavatam is the speaker of Uddhava Gita. Establishes Vedic philosophy. He's very consistent. Why would we see that in his chart? Well, I think it's very simple that the sun in the fourth house here is in a fixed sign, Leo, which means that the ascendant is also a fixed sign. You may say, what do you mean consistency? He had these radical changes in his life, like I described earlier. Well, the consistency from the fourth house is mostly in the consistency of ideology or belief or devotion. The frequent and rather radical changes to his external situations can be seen from Ketu's very strong influence on the ascendant. Elizabeth Taylor, does she have consistency of beliefs and concepts? Maybe, kinda, I don't know. It's definitely not something she's known for. And her sun in the fourth house is in a dual sign. Joseph Goebbels, on the other hand, extreme stability or consistency of beliefs, extreme dedication to those beliefs, etc. Why, once again, like Krishna, his sun is in the fourth house in a fixed sign. This time it's Scorpio. But similar to Krishna, the external's changing a lot. In Goebel's case, the object of his devotion changes a lot, and that's similar with Krishna, seen from the influence of Ketu on his ascendant. So now we know what the sun in the fourth house signifies. We know the kind of vague theory, and we've been able to apply the vague theory to some specific cases in specific charts and see how it actually works. Hopefully that gives you the tools that you need to have to be able to continue exploring the sun in the fourth house and all the rest of the possible combinations in astrology. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. To understand the sun in the sixth house, we should just take a second to make sure that we understand the sun and the sixth house. So let's do a quick review first of what the sixth house is all about. As you can see here, the sixth house literally physically is the part of the sky that's just below the western horizon. Everything that the sixth house symbolizes can be summarized by the phrase supporting the west. So in other words, whatever the west or the sunset symbolizes, the sixth house symbolizes things that support that. The sunset symbolizes disappearance. The sixth house, therefore, symbolizes everything that leads to disappearance or supports disappearance. This is why it's the house of confusion, not being able to see things. And another meaning of disappearance is death. Sunset signifies death. So sixth house signifies things that support death or lead to death. That's illness. Now, the seventh house or the sunset also signifies other people. And so the sixth house is about things which support other people, things which benefit other people in contrast to things which benefit you. This is why it's the house of your enemies. Enemies don't support you. They're against you. They support somebody else. So the sixth house has to do with enemies, enmity itself, and dealing with enemies. So the sixth house is a place for fighting. Another sense of supporting other people is to work for them, work for their benefit. So the sixth is a house of duties, service, chores, work. And it's the house of debt because it's the house of what you owe to other people, what you have to give to other people. And so service, servitude, indebtedness, indenturedness, etc. So that was a good quick review of what the sixth house is all about. Let's do a similar thing really fast for what the sun is all about. The sun symbolizes the soul, which means awareness, because the sun is very, very bright. And brightness or light facilitates awareness of things. So the sun is the planet that represents vision and visibility. Because it represents visibility, it has to do with the public side of your life, the visible side of your life. How public are you? How well known are you? How famous are you? How willing are you to be public? How extroversive are you? Or in short, how male are you? How outgoing or outward are you? And because the sun has to do with vision, it has to do with command, leadership, authority, having vision, enforcing vision, and so on. Soul also implies identity. And so this is why the sun has to do with the self, the ego, the identity, and the self-esteem. And by extension, the sun just represents the self of anything. So in other words, the core, the centrality of a thing, or the stability, the core of a thing is very stable. And finally, soul is the thing which gives life and animates something. So the sun has a lot to do with our health and our vitality. Now, let's compare the sun and the sixth house and see what things they have in common or maybe directly opposite. So the main thing, the very, very, very important thing, it's so important that it's almost a fundamental principle of interpretations in astrology, is that the sun and the sixth house get along very well because their basic natures are very complementary. The sun is maleness, and and the sixth house is fighting. Men are good at warfare and fighting. So basically, to put a male tough planet like the sun in a male tough house like the sixth is overwhelmingly good. Similarly as putting a soft feminine planet in a soft feminine house would be overwhelmingly good. And then what's really bad is when you mix the two, when you cross the two. So what we want to do with our interpretations of the sun in the sixth house is bear in mind that the fundamental of it is very synergistic. To have a dominant, assertive male planet in the house that deals with our enemies is a good thing. So basically, the interpretation is that these natives with the sun in the sixth house, they know how to fight. They fight well, they fight efficiently. It doesn't mean that they fight too much. It doesn't mean that they fight a lot. It means they fight well. If you're not scared of fighting, you're strong, you're brave. The reason why they're not scared of fighting is because they know how to win. They overcome their opponents, they overcome their obstacles. They're successful because of this. The next thing that we should evaluate about the sun in the sixth house is that the sun has to do with vision, but the sixth has to do with confusion. On the surface, that seems to be a clash. It seems to be an opposite thing. But we want to turn this around and interpret it as a synergy, because the maleness of the sun fundamentally and the toughness of the sixth house fundamentally is making things go right with the sun in the sixth house. So what we want to do with this issue of the planet of vision being in the house of confusion is we want to use a positive twist on it. And we say, these people are clear. They're confident. They're intelligent. They see things clearly. They have clear-cut definitions of things. In that sense, they're intelligent. They're not confused. They're not doubtful. They know what they want, and they know how to get it. Another thing is that the sun is about leadership, but the sixth house is about indebtedness and servitude. So again, that seems to be a clash, but we want to turn it around and interpret it as a positive thing. So people with the sun in the sixth house, they're leaders. They tend to be obeyed, or at least followed. They tend to be respected. They are not submissive or subordinate people. They're dominant and assertive. And the last thing that I want to mention is that the sun is the planet of health and the sixth house is the house of illness. And again, that looks like it's a clash, but since it's a subtext for the main thing, which is maleness in that house of enemies, then we're going to put this in a positive light too. Although this one is the weakest of the conversions to a positive light because it has the least to do with the maleness dynamic. You see, these other things, vision, confusion, clarity, it's a male trait. Clarity. Men can be overly clear sometimes and can be overly simplistic in their quick decisions. Leadership, dominance, assertion, extroversion, men have this trait. It can become too much sometimes. You get this concept of mansplaining, etc. So these two things that we looked at before, they're very related to the gender thing of the sun, the maleness being welcome in this house. So we really want to not consider vision versus confusion to be a clash. We don't want to consider leadership versus servitude to be a clash. Health and illness is not really so related to this gender thing. So we can turn this around as a positive interpretation, but with less force or less certainty. We should basically expect that people with the sun in the sixth house would be healthy and attractive, but it's not as difficult to overturn this particular part of the interpretation from other stuff in the chart. Now we have a pretty good theoretical understanding of what the sun does in the sixth house, how we should interpret the sun in the sixth house. Let's try to polish this up and sharpen it up by looking at 3 charts that have the sun in the sixth house and asking how well these interpretations work in these actual charts. So let's start with the basic thing that the sun in the sixth house indicates a person who can fight well. They're strong, they're brave, they are successful because they overcome their opponents. The three charts that I have to illustrate sun in the sixth house is Aretha Franklin, Lionel Messi, and Russell Brand. Was Aretha Franklin strong, brave, etc.? Yes. Why is she such a good example of the sun in the sixth house? Well, it's the sun in the sixth house by itself and exalted. If a planet is in a house exalted and by itself, that really helps to actually get the interpretations to come true in a very clear way and in a very good form. Additionally, her sun is the 10th lord in the sixth house, which also brings the lord of confidence, the lord of extroversion, the lord of maleness into this. Furthermore, in addition to having a very good sun, she has a very good moon, a moon in its own sign in the 9th house. So her personality indicators, sun and moon, are getting to be very strong or solid. Now, how about Lionel Messi? Is he a good example of somebody who fights well? So of course, he's a super successful athlete. That's all athletes do all day long is fight. So how come it's so applicable for Lionel Messi as well? First of all, his sun in his sixth house is very influential in that house. It's very close to the degree of the ascendant, which means that it's very close to the cusp of this whole sign house. So what the closer that a planet is to the cusp of its house, the more strongly that interpretation should be taken. Secondly, his fifth lord is in his sixth house as well, Mercury, and his sixth lord, Moon, is in his fifth house. So he has a house exchange of Parivartana between the fifth and the sixth houses. So not only is his sun in the sixth house, but his sixth house is in an exchange with the fifth. This is a good yoga for athletes and warriors because it gives martial or strategic intelligence. It gives intelligence about how to deal with problems. Furthermore, he also has Mars in the sixth house, which is also good to put another masculine planet in this masculine house. And that Mars is also the third lord and the 10th lord. So those are masculine lordships. And to have the third lord in the sixth house is also very, very helpful to a warrior or an athlete. Now, finally, how about Russell Brand? Is he able to fight well? Is he strong, brave? Does he overcome opponents' obstacles? Yes, super. That's his personality. He's very unassailable. So next to his sun in the sixth house, he also has the sixth lord. So not only is the sun in the sixth house, the sixth lord is in the sixth house, and not only is the sun in the sixth house, the sun is with the sixth lord. His sun is the eighth lord in the sixth house, which gives him a kind of critical strength, like a subversive strength. Lionel Messi has that as well, has the eighth lord in the sixth house, which gives him the same thing, but in his context of being an athlete, it gives him the ability to see through your bluffs. The second trait about the sun in the sixth house was supposed to be a person who's very clear, not confused, very confident and intelligent. Does Aretha Franklin match that? Yeah. She's very clear about exactly what she wanted to do, and she overcome great odds in getting it. That's what I said about this kind of confidence. I know what I want, and I know how to get it, and I'm going to get it. So reasoning for that would be everything that we already talked about previously, all those same factors. Her intellect might not be her defining characteristic because her fifth house has a debilitated Mercury in it. So it's not going to be the kind of intellect where this is a person that debates very well or stuff like that. It's more of a quiet intellect. She's considered a genius of her art. Lionel Messi is a very clear, confident, intelligent, certainly. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to play sports well. Again, that same issue of 5 and 6, that's what I was saying. Get this intelligence or clarity for fighting, for dealing with opponents. Russell Brand, is he very intelligent? Probably of the three, he would be the most. Why? It's because his first lord and his fifth lord are joined in the seventh house, aspecting the first house. Another thing we said about the sun in the sixth house is that you get leaders, people who are obeyed, respected, dominant, assertive. Aretha Franklin, she's respect. She's the singer of respect. So yeah, but then you can say, but she's singing that she wants respect. So maybe she didn't really get it. Her fame and everything is kind of complex because her first lord and her fifth lord are joined, which is actually just like Russell Brand's. But her fifth and first lord are joined in the eighth house, whereas Russell Brand was in the seventh and aspecting the ascendant. So you get a person who is very intelligent and who is very confident and who is very respected, certainly, but doesn't really look like that type of person, doesn't really act like that type of person, doesn't really have a strident attitude. The eighth house is more like behind the scenes and covered. In addition, she has Saturn aspecting her ascendant, which tends to give self-negativity. So that self-negativity is competing with the self-confidence. Lionel Messi, on the other hand, is just more clearly, simply dominant and assertive and getting people's respect. This is because his first lord isn't in his eighth house. It's aspecting his ascendant from the 11th. And on top of that, it is in a mutual aspect with the fourth and ninth lord, which is a Raja Yoga for the first lord. So Aretha Franklin also has a Raja Yoga for her first lord, but it's in the eighth house. Lionel Messi has a Raja Yoga for his first lord in the 11th house where it aspects the ascendant. And that was also the case for Russell Brand. So in order to get the interpretation of having a lot of self-confidence, etc., besides having the sun in the sixth house, you also want to look at the first house, because the first house also represents self. In the cases of Lionel Messi and Russell Brand, you have super powerful first houses because the first lord is in Raja Yoga, aspecting the first house. In Aretha Franklin's case, you almost have that. You have the first lord in a Raja Yoga, but it's not aspecting the first house, and instead Saturn is aspecting the first house. So for her, it's a little bit more toned down. The final thing that we mentioned was healthy and attractive. Aretha Franklin, yes and no. Again, I'm not a person that's a fan of making weight seem like it's unattractive, but weight past a certain point can be unhealthy. So I think she had weight issues as well. So the health and beauty of Aretha Franklin is there, and it's also not there. Again, this has to do with her first lord being in the eighth house. And if you look at it very carefully, her first lord is in the eighth house, so is her second lord, which is very important for health and diet. And so is her sixth lord, which is very important for health. So in her case, the exalted sun in the sixth house is giving beauty and health, but it's competing with having the second and sixth lords in the eighth house. And of course, as we previously mentioned, having Saturn aspect the ascendant. Lionel Messi, on the other hand, is an athlete, so there's no question about being super healthy. And he's a very handsome fellow. So again, that goes right back to the importance of the first house. If you want to see if somebody's healthy or if you want to see if they're attractive, it's not just the sun. It's the first house, and his first house is great because his first lord is aspecting the ascendant while in a Raja Yoga. And that's the same thing with Russell Brand. Really handsome guy, pretty healthy, and so he has that same thing with the first lord being in a Raja Yoga while aspecting the ascendant. I would say only pretty healthy because the sixth house is a little bit weird with K2 in it. So I hope that you now have a good basic understanding of what the sun represents, what the sixth house represents, how to basically work with the interpretation of the sun in the sixth house, and how in three specific cases it took three specific forms. if you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. To understand the sun in the 7th house, let's take a second to review and make sure that we understand what the sun symbolizes and what the 7th house symbolizes. So here's the 7th house. As you can see, it is physically or literally the area of sky around the western horizon. What happens in the western horizon? The sun sets, and that's the basis for everything that the 7th house represents. Sunset means things disappearing, and that's why the 7th house is the house of endings, or another way to put it is dispersion, or things going away, things leaving, things traveling. The sunset also signifies other people because the sun signifies the self. When the sun sets, then the self becomes less prominent and other people become more prominent. This is why the 7th house is the house of partnerships with other people, especially marriage. And that's why the 7th house has to do with the things we do in marriage. Intercourse, cooperation, and not just in marriage, but in any partnership, cooperation. And another ramification of intercourse or cooperation is exchange. And so the 7th house is all about how we exchange with people, and that has a commercial aspect to it as well. That's what we need to know about the 7th house. Let's take a look at the sun now really fast to make sure we understand it. The sun signifies the soul because it's a very bright planet. It's the brightest planet. And the soul is the source of awareness, and awareness is symbolized by light. Light facilitates awareness. So the sun represents vision, what light enables, vision and visibility. Because it signifies visibility, it signifies publicness, publicity, fame, extroversiveness, maleness, outwardness. Because it signifies vision, it therefore signifies command or authority or leadership, the person who has the vision and sets the direction. Because the soul is the locus of awareness, it is also the locus of identity. So identity is the result of awareness. So the sun signifies self, and it has to do with your ego, your self-esteem. The self is the core or the locus from which everything else happens, and thus the sun represents the core or the central point, the stabilizing point. One last thing about the soul is that it's the source of vitality, and the sun similarly signifies health and vitality. Now we can talk about how the sun interacts with the 7th house. And basically, they're pretty diametric. The sun has to do with visibility. Fundamentally, the sun is bright. It has to do with visibility. But the 7th house is where the sun sets. It has to do with disappearance. So this fundamental clash between the symbolism of visibility and disappearance indicates a problem with visibility. The person goes unnoticed. They get overlooked. They're not seen. Another big dichotomy between the sun and the 7th house is that the sun symbolizes the self, and the 7th house symbolizes other people. So this dichotomy gives rise to the interpretation that a person with the sun in the 7th house has relationship difficulties. They have difficulty achieving a symbiosis between the self and others. In other words, they can't see the self as a part of a unit with others, and they can't see others as being valuable or important to the self. So some sort of relationship problem where the self is either sacrificing other people or being sacrificed for the sake of other people, not having a symbiotic, mutually beneficial concept of the relationship between self and others. Another dichotomy between the sun and the 7th house is that the sun is the big authority figure giving orders, but the 7th house is a place for cooperation and democracy. So the interpretation of the clash between these symbols is that this person has cooperation problems, especially in the sense of conflicting with the person who's giving the orders, conflicting with the decision makers, conflicting with the leaders. Finally, the sun is the life force, but the 7th house signifies death. And this indicates a person that doesn't have an abundance of vitality or has a problem with their life force, gets unhealthy. So this doesn't sound that great, does it? The sun in the 7th house is doomy and gloomy. So does that mean that if you have the sun in the 7th house, you are doomed and gloomed to be unnoticed, unhealthy, uncooperative, and self-destructive or destructive of others in bad relationships? Well, yes and no. The color black is the color black, but just about in every shade of pink or yellow or orange or any bright color, there's a little bit of black. So similarly, the sun in the 7th house is kind of black. Like literally, it's the sun setting. That is not the only color in your painting. So you have to see how it mixes with the other factors that affect the sun and with the other factors that are in the chart. So now, let's turn our attention to some actual well-known people that have the sun in the 7th house. And obviously, there wouldn't be any well-known people with the sun in the 7th house if the only thing that existed in their chart was the sun in the 7th house. So just the fact that we have known people, noticed people with the sun in the 7th house means that you have to blend this factor with all the rest of the factors. But don't shy away from keeping your black paint black. The black paint is black. Don't be afraid of it. Just realize that it's going to mix with other colors. So, 3 people with reliable birth times who have the sun in the 7th house: Barack Obama, Steve Jobs, and Charles Manson. Let's first look at the quality that they should be unnoticed. Obviously, none of these people are unnoticed. They're all famous people. So why? Well, Barack Obama, the first thing that should come to your attention is, he has the sun in the 7th house, but it's the sun in Leo. So that means he has the 7th Lord in the 7th house. The sun in Leo is hardly the same thing, symbolically speaking, as the sun in the 7th house, nor is the 7th Lord in the 7th house the same thing. So the indications of the sun in the 7th house are being mixed with colors which are very different from that. Furthermore, his sun in the 7th house is in Raja Yoga with the 5th Lord and is right very close to the cusp of the 7th house, which puts it very close to being exactly opposite to the ascendant, which means that the sun in Leo in a Raja Yoga, a King's Yoga, is directly affecting the 1st house, the most important point in the chart. So you would be kind of infantile to think that just because he has the sun in the 7th house, he must be an unnoticed person. Steve Jobs also really is not an unnoticed person. Everybody knows about Steve Jobs, but it's a little bit less so than Barack Obama. He was often overlooked, and he was often not the first choice for things that he really should have probably been the first choice for. So the really important thing in Steve Jobs' chart is the mutual aspect between Jupiter and Venus. You'll notice that it's extremely exact, and it's extremely exactly aligned with the ascendant degree. Jupiter and Venus are both at 21 degrees, and the ascendant degree is at 22. So this is a really powerful mutual aspect that is very influential in the 11th and 5th houses. Jupiter happens to be his 7th lord, Venus happens to be his 9th lord, so this mutual aspect between Jupiter and Venus is a Raja Yoga, which makes a person very prominent and successful, and it's in his 11th and 5th houses very strongly, so it affects his intellect and his fortune. There is a 75% aspect, or Tripadadrishti, from Venus to the ascendant, which does give him an ability to be successful, but it's a little bit of a step down from a Barack Obama. As for Charles Manson, is he unnoticed? Well, you could say definitely, because literally he's put in jail for his whole life. People can't see him. However, we all know about him, and he's very famous, and he's one of the biggest names in modern history. So why is that? Again, it's a case of things aspecting the 1st house. In his case, he has the 1st lord aspecting the 1st house. And then his 10th lord, which is very important for things like fame, is in the 10th house. And it's with Rahu, when it's the 10th lord and the 9th lord as a yoga karaka, So that means that it's forming a Raja Yoga by its union with Rahu in the 10th house. So he has the 10th Lord in the 10th house in a Raja Yoga, and he has the first Lord aspecting the first house. So again, you would be kind of silly to say that, well, he has the sun in the 7th house, so he must be unnoticed. Furthermore, he also has, like Obama, he also has a Raja Yoga of the 7th and 5th influencing his first house. So he has the 7th Lord Mars in the 5th house, while the 5th Lord Mercury is in the 7th house, making an exchange of 5 and 7, which is a Raja Yoga, exchanging a Kendra and a Kona, an angle and a trine. And his Mercury is at 3 degrees and his ascendant is at 5 degrees. So that Mercury is very, very strongly sending that Raja Yoga by aspect into the actual ascendant. So he becomes very famous. Now, let's consider the third factor, the third thing that we talked about with the sun in the 7th house, the fact that it should trouble the relationships. Does Barack Obama have this relationship difficulty? I would say yes, but no. Yes, in the sense that he's the president of the United States, so obviously he's not a submissive fellow. He wants to be the leader. He needs to be the king. And that's indicative of the sun in the 7th house, a real need to be the king. But no, in the sense that he's very successful at it, he's very good at it, and also has very excellent marriage. So there must be conditions in his chart where this relationship dynamic is just impelling him to be a leader, but not making him abusive to others or disliked by others. What is that in his chart? First of all, it's the same thing that we brought up already. The sun in the 7th house is the 7th Lord in the 7th house, and it's the sun in Leo, so it's very comfortable being in that 7th house. It's in a conjunction with the 5th Lord, forming a Raja Yoga, and then it's sending that Raja Yoga to the 1st house by its aspect on the ascendant. Besides this fact, the subsidiary 7th house is like the 7th house from Venus. Venus's 7th Lord is also in Venus's 7th house, and the moon's 7th Lord is in the moon's 9th house. So the 7th Lord is in the 7th house, Venus's 7th Lord is in the 7th house, the moon's 7th Lord is in the 9th house. His 7th house is actually doing really fine. The only thing that's weird about it is that the sun is in the 7th house. And so in that mixture of colors, you get a very bright color with a little bit of a shade of black in it, which is the need to be a king. How about Steve Jobs? Does he have weird relationships, difficulty relationships? I would definitely say this is a big yes for Steve Jobs. He has a very unusual family relationship, really unusual relationship with his wife in the early stages, with his child. With Jobs, the reason why it eventually turns out good is just because of that Raja Yoga between Jupiter and Venus being so dominant in the 5th and the 11th houses. The 5th will have an effect on marriage. Charles Manson, he's an even better match. I mean, he's like a super good descriptor of how bad the sun in the 7th house can be if you add more black to it from other things in the chart. So in his case, his sun in the 7th house is conjoined to his 1st Lord in the 7th house, which is the same interpretation as the sun in the 7th house. You see, the sun is like a natural ambassador of the 1st house. It's the Bhavakarka for the 1st house, because they symbolize basically the same thing. They both symbolize self. So he's got a double whammy. He has the sun in the 7th house and he has the 1st Lord in the 7th house. That's a double whammy on all of those things that we went over. But the real thing in Manson's chart is this very, very unstable moon by its conjunction with Rahu. Both of them at 4 degrees, both of them right on the ascendant degree, more or less. The ascendant degree is 5. So very dominant in the 10th house. Very dominant, very, very dominant in the chart. This really unstable moon, which is not going... If you have a very, very unstable moon like this, in addition to the sun in the 7th house and the 1st Lord in the 7th house, you're not going to be a person that treats other people very well. The third thing that we talked about was cooperation problems, conflicting with leaders. Obama, not really. He's he is a leader. He is the authority, the decision maker, he's the president. Again, that just has to do with, well, his sun in the 7th house is in Leo. Steve Jobs, yes, he really does have this issue. Cooperation, conflict with leaders, being iconoclastic, going against authority, being the underdog, going against the mainstream. He is, however, able to be a leader himself on a smaller scale than Barack Obama, because his sun in this, one of the major reasons is his sun in the 7th house is the only planet that's anywhere in any of his 4 kendras. So that sun nature is dominant in him. Charles Manson, cooperation problems? I don't know. I don't think so. Duh, of course, Charles Manson's the worst. He's an outlaw. So look at his sun. It's in Scorpio, and then compare that to Barack Obama. And this is a good lesson. It can be this simple. Barack Obama, sun in the 7th house. Charles Manson, sun in the 7th house. But Charles Manson's 7th house is Scorpio. Barack Obama's 7th house is Leo. Sun in Leo is very good with authorities, and it's good at being an authority. Sun in Scorpio is a double whammy. Scorpio itself is iconoclastic and anti-authoritarian. Sun is the authority. So Manson's sun is all kinds of messed up. The sun is in the 7th house, that already clashes it with everything. The sun is in Scorpio, that already clashes it with everything. And then he's also got the first lord in the 7th house, which is exactly like the sun in the 7th house. So he's a triple whammy. 3 doses of black. Besides that, his moon is wacky by its destabilizing conjunction with Rahu right on the cusp. And besides that, even he has a chart where only 3 signs are occupied, which makes a person, or indicates an aggressive type of person. The final consideration for Sun in the 7th house is that it has an adverse effect on health. Barack Obama, he seems to be pretty healthy. And really, it's all the same reasons that we've been talking about. Sun in the 7th house in its own sign, that's fine. Sun in the 7th house in a Raja Yoga with the 5th lord, that's great. Sun aspecting the 1st house, that's also very healthy. Besides this, some new information, he has the 2nd lord in the 1st house, and he has the 1st lord in his own sign. Steve Jobs, unhealthy? Yes. Died of cancer at a fairly young age. And so it's not only the sun in the 7th house that made Steve Jobs unhealthy, it's also really the fact that his 1st lord is in the 6th, while his moon is in the 8th with the 8th lord, and his 6th lord, Saturn, is aspecting his 2nd lord, Venus, perfectly, exactly. As I'm saying, think of it like colors. As far as the health thing goes, sun in 7th house is a black color. To have your 6th lord aspect your 2nd lord is also a black color. To have Saturn aspect your 2nd lord is also a black color. To have the moon in the 8th house is also a black color. To have the moon with the 8th lord is also a black color. To have the 1st lord in the 6th house is also a black color. Steve Jobs had all of those. Charles Manson, his health kind of is fine. His real problem is his mental health. So his physical health is fine, which is obvious because his 1st lord is aspecting his 1st house, and his 2nd lord is also aspecting his 1st house. But the mental health is the real thing for him, and that's also obvious because his moon is exactly conjoined to Rahu in the company of Saturn, in a chart with only 3 signs occupied right on the ascendant degree. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. Understand the sun in the 8th house. Let's just stop for a minute and make sure that we're on the same page about what the 8th house represents. As you can see here, physically, literally, the 8th house is the part of the sky which is above the western horizon. And that's the reason why the 8th house symbolizes whatever it symbolizes. So the area of sky which is above a horizon is the area that's full of the wind and the rain and the clouds that erode the land beneath it. That's 8. 8 is above the western horizon, and 12 is above the east. Those houses are erosive to the symbolism of the house that's below it. So that means that the 8th house means what it means because it's erosive to the symbolism of the 7th. What happens in the west is sunset. So the 8th house signifies things which are erosive or subtractive from sunset. The first meaning of sunset is that the sun becomes invisible. You can't see it anymore, and darkness comes. You can't see things. So if we say that the 8th house is erosive or subtractive of invisibility, then we will understand what the 8th house really symbolizes. It symbolizes mysticism, the ability to see the unknown. It symbolizes the occult, the knowing of secrets. It symbolizes psychicness, psychic intuition, and even psychology, understanding the way invisible things work. It also just signifies insight in general, especially the capacity to analyze. To analyze something and derive a truth from it or a fact from it. To derive something real from something amorphous. The ability to find information, research. A further implication of invisibility is death. You go bye-bye. So the 7th with the west has to do with death. The 8th house is erosive of death. That's why it's the house of longevity. Now you might be confused because I thought it was a death kind of house. Yes, of course it's the house of longevity. When your longevity is over, you're dead. So the 8th house is extremely important for death because it's the house of longevity and vitality and life force, and that's why it's also the house of reproduction and sexuality, which is the act of reproduction. One other thing about the sunset is that the sun represents the self. So when it sets, the self is not the important thing. Now other people are important. The 8th house is erosive of subtractive of others. So this is why the 8th house is the house of personal gain, what we get from other people. So this is why it has to do with inheritance, what you gain, especially because it also has to do with death. But not just death, inheritance, getting gifts from other people, getting donations, being the beneficiary of favors, etc. is an 8th house topic. Also, erosive of others or erosive of partnership. That's the 8th house's quality. It's to be erosive of partnership. That means to be defiant and individualistic, non-cooperative. Now we have a good understanding of what the 8th house represents. We could talk about what the sun in the 8th house symbolizes, but let's take one more second just to make sure that we're on the same page about what the sun symbolizes. The sun symbolizes the soul because it's very bright. It's the brightest planet, and the soul has to do with awareness, and awareness is a result of light. We see things and are aware of things because of light. So light symbolizes awareness. Awareness is a function of the soul. Therefore, the sun, which is the brightest planet, symbolizes the soul and awareness. Light enables two things, vision and visibility. So the sun signifies visibility, which means it's the planet that determines how public you are, how visible you are, how extroversive you are. Or an extroversive is a male trait, going out. Because the sun also signifies vision, it has to do with having vision, setting direction, being a commander, being a leader, being an authority. An implication of the soul being awareness is that the soul is also the center of identity. It's the core. Awareness is the core from which we experience. So sun represents self, ego, and self-esteem. The sun in general just represents core things, centrality, the stabilizing anchor in the middle of a thing. And finally, the soul, which is the source of awareness. Awareness is the key characteristic of life. So sun symbolizes life, life force, vitality, and therefore symbolizes health. Now we know what we need to know to be able to talk fruitfully about the sun in the 8th house. So let's compare the symbolism of the sun with the symbolism of the 8th house and where it sounds up together, where they're talking about similar things. That's what we need to focus on for the interpretation. The sun represents the self, and the 8th house represents the self because it's individualistic, because it's subtractive or erosive of others. So when the sun is in this 8th house, the interpretation is an individualistic person. A person who breaks molds, iconoclastic, who is norm defiant, nonconformist, rebellious, and could also be uncooperative. So some famous people with known birth times with the sun in the 8th house: Hugh Hefner, Tracy Lords, Edgar Cayce, and Adolf Hitler. Good examples of people that are rebellious: Hitler, nonconformist, unusual, individualistic. In particular, Hugh Hefner, his chart. Let's take a look at his chart. We haven't really looked at that before. So why is he such a mold breaker, norm breaker? It is not normal to make sex and nudity a public thing. It's a private thing. But he broke that norm and he put it on the magazine shelf. Why was he able to do that? Well, he has the sun in the 8th house, but so do a bunch of other people that might wind up shy. But look at how the sun in the 8th house is supported by other factors in his chart. First of all, it's in Aries in the 8th house. So it's exalted in the 8th house. It's very powerful. Second of all, it's at 19 degrees when his ascendant is at 14 degrees. So it's very close to the cusp of the 8th house. So it's very dominant on the 8th house. But the reason why he's not a Hitler, for example, Hitler also has the sun in the 8th house, but Hitler was not a hedonistic rebel. Hitler was a political rebel and a warlike rebel. Hugh Hefner is like a sexual rebel. Why? Well, look at his 7th house. It's got exalted Venus and the moon in the 7th house. And his moon is the 11th lord, the lord of pleasure. It's in his 7th house. And it's at 13 degrees when his ascendant is at 14. So he has a tremendous influence from the 11th lord on the ascendant from the 7th house in the company of an exalted Venus. In that context, the sun in Aries in the 8th house makes him a rebel in the context of sensuality, sexuality, hedonism, enjoyment of the opposite sex. Another thing about the sun is that it has to do with vision. And the 8th house is erosive of invisibility, so it has to do with vision. So with the sun in the 8th house, people are insightful. They have vision. They're intuitive, or they have a vision, especially for things which are invisible or hidden, private, or kept secret. So some important names of well-known people with sun in the 8th house in this regard: Edgar Cayce, Deepak Chopra, Hermann Hesse. So here's Edgar Cayce's chart. Why is he so mystical, occulty, intuitive, psychic? Why? Look at his 8th house. It doesn't just have the sun in it. It's got basically everything in it. The only thing that is not really tucked away in his 8th house or its 6th is his exalted moon. So obviously he's an extremely psychic, intuitive person. Also, that sun that is in his 8th house is at 28 degrees when his ascendant is 24 degrees. So it's really on the cusp of the 8th house, which means in whole sign house system, on the cusp means at the sensitive point of the house, very dominant in the house. There's a different way of looking at this same dynamic, that the sun represents vision and the 8th house represents vision. The sun represents vision in the sense of being pro-visibility, but the 8th house represents vision in the sense of being anti-invisibility, which basically is the same thing. So it has this positive aspect of making a person very insightful and intelligent. But it also has a weird twist to it that it tends to make a person not see things which are obvious. See things which are invisible or idealistic, but not see things which are obvious or practical. So with the sun in the 8th house, you find people that are impractical or out of touch or unaware of conventional things. One last thing about the sun in the 8th house, the sun represents vitality, and so does the 8th house, because the 8th house is erosive of death. So it's all about longevity or vitality. So sun in the 8th house, we can say this person is spirited, they have a lot of vitality, they have good longevity, they're strong, and they can have that reproductive charisma, sexiness to them. An example of a person in this regard is LeBron James. And then the very interesting thing is the dichotomy between LeBron James and a person like Edgar Cayce. Edgar Cayce is a real soft person, not macho. But LeBron James is a big macho guy with huge arms, super tall, sports guy. They both have the sun in the 8th house. How is that? Well, for LeBron James, his sun is the 3rd lord. 3rd lord is a masculine, athletic planet. The sun in the 8th house, giving vitality and health, is going to give it in a muscular way, being the 3rd lord. Also, LeBron James has the moon in Aries, the most masculine sign, whereas Edgar Cayce has it in Taurus, one of the 2 most feminine signs. Also, LeBron James has Mars alone in the 10th house. Edgar Cayce has Moon alone in the 10th house. Mars is the most masculine planet, and Moon is one of the most feminine planets. And finally, the real thing for LeBron James, sometimes you get this. LeBron James has the sun in the 8th house, so we can use him as an example of the sun in the 8th house, but it's not particularly dominant in his chart. With LeBron James, the key thing in his chart is that Saturn is in his 6th house. That makes a person really strong and powerful as a fighter. And it's at 25 degrees while the ascendant is at 26. Whereas Edgar Cayce, he did have an exalted Mars in his 6th house, giving him that fighting with the norm, etc. But it's not really close to the ascendant degree. It's his dominant thing is sun in the 8th house. Sun is at 28 degrees. LeBron James' dominant thing is Saturn in the 6th, but he also happens to have sun in the 8th, which gives him a spiritedness, strength, health, makes him insightful, able to see through people's bluffs on the court, and defiant. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. Sun in the 9th house. If we want to understand it, let's take a second first to make sure that we understand both the sun and the 9th house. And let's start with the 9th house. Here it is. As you can see, it is in the upper portion of the sky on the western side of that area. And that is the reason why it symbolizes everything that it symbolizes, because the upper portion of the sky represents our actual deeds out in public, our public actions, our actions in the world. And the western area of the sky represents other people. So the 9th house represents the concept of how our actions affect others. In other words, it's about dharma or morality. So everything about this house can be organized around these 2 concepts of values and morals. So it should be therefore no surprise that the 9th house signifies philosophy, religion, and virtues. What is philosophy, religion, and virtues? It's a bunch of values about what's right and what's wrong. Now, where do you get your philosophy from? That process is called education. And where do you get education from? You get it from educators. That's why the ninth house represents teachers and parents. And the ninth house is all about good deeds because it's all about morals, the philosophy in action. So the ninth house has the nature of being important for moral action. Ahimsa, the concept of not doing things to other people that you would not want them to do to you. And since it's the house of good deeds, it's also the house of good results. This is why it's a house of prosperity, success, and good fortune or good luck. Now that is the ninth house. We're almost ready to talk about the sun in the ninth house, but before we do that, we should make sure that we realize that we know what the sun is all about. Yeah. Well, the sun is very bright, isn't it? It's the brightest planet, and that's why it symbolizes the soul. Because the soul is the quantum of awareness, and awareness is synonymous with light. The light goes on, then you become aware of what's around you. So light is symbolic of awareness, which is the primary quality of the soul. So the sun symbolizes light, which means it symbolizes vision and visibility. So the sun signifies visibility. That means that it signifies how visible you are, how public are you, how famous are you, how well known are you. Also, how extroversive are you? How much are you making yourself visible? Which also means how masculine are you? And because the sun represents vision, it represents the people who have vision and give direction. So it has to do with authorities, commanders, leaders. Now, another thing about the soul, because it's the quantum of awareness, it's also therefore the quantum of identity. Because identity is based on perception. We identify ourselves based on what we perceive. So the sun represents identity, and that's why it's the planet for the self, in the sense of what identity do you have? What ego do you have? How much self-esteem do you have? And since the self is the core of our being, the sun represents the core of things, the identity of things, the actual essence of things. So it signifies the essential core, the thing which is the anchor, the thing which is not going away, the thing that can't be removed, the thing that's stable. And finally, the soul is the essence of life. Life is awareness. And so the sun represents vitality and life force and health. All right, now that we reviewed the sun and the ninth house, we're competent and ready to discuss what the sun represents when it's in the ninth house. The way that you do such things is you think, what does this planet symbolize? What does the house symbolize? Where are they on the same page? Whether as allies or as opponents on the same page, on the same topic. So for example, the sun is the father, right? The male authority figure. And the ninth house has to do with parents, educators, people that give you your philosophy. So the sun is the father and the ninth house is the parents. That goes well together. Therefore, the sun in the ninth house signifies a person who's able to be in a parental role, especially in a male parental role, masculine parental role. So it signifies a good leader. It signifies a person who respects family. And so they work hard for the people that depend on them. They're a good leader, so they think about how their actions and decisions will affect and impact the people who they're leading. The sun in the ninth house represents people who respect education. Just like you respect family, because what is family? Family is an organic form of a school. And so similarly, if you respect family, you would respect this concept of school, education, teachers, learning. So people with sun in the ninth house tend to get educated and therefore tend to be rather smart. Another thing about the sun and the ninth house where they get on the same page is that the sun has to do with law because it's the commander. It has vision, so it sets the path. This way is right, that way is wrong. And the ninth house is very congenial with that because it's also about law. It's about what's right and what's wrong. It's about morals and ethics, right? So you have a very lawful planet, the sun, in a very lawful house, the ninth. So what do you think the interpretation is? Here's a person who's lawful. They respect law. They respect tradition. They respect religion. But there's one thing going on with the sun which is not compatible with the ninth house. The sun represents the self, but the ninth house is towards the west. So the ninth house is oriented towards others. And so there's a slight clash between the sun and the ninth house, which is about the self versus other people, and the importance of the self versus the importance of other people. It's only a slight clash, and it's going along with these other two areas which are very synergistic. So what it really just does is it kind of puts a sour note into these other interpretations slightly. And that's why I worded things like they take trouble, right? Like they will sacrifice for their people. They work hard for their people. Because it feels kind of like a hard work because of this clash between self and others. Or they respect family, or they respect education, or they respect teachers, or they respect religion. Because it's a little difficult. It's not like they are enjoy family or enjoy religion or get happiness from family, religion, teachers, education, etc. But they respect it. And the reason for wording it that way is because of this clash between self and others. So, now that we have a pretty good theory of what the sun in the ninth house represents, let's take a look at 4 actual charts of fairly well-known people who have the sun in the ninth house. Martin Luther King, Albert Einstein, Prabhupada, and Rama. The thing that really jumps out to me about Martin Luther King when I think that he has the sun in the ninth house, works hard for their people. Works hard is Capricorn. So his sun is in his ninth house in Capricorn, and it is there as the 4th Lord. And the 4th Lord is about roots and culture and background. Your ancestors, ancestry. So working really hard for the rights of his race. Working really hard for the rights of his people. Albert Einstein also has the sun in the ninth house, but he's not Martin Luther King, nor is Martin Luther King Albert Einstein. Well, one thing that's different about the two of them is that Einstein's ninth house is Pisces, not Capricorn. And so Pisces is the most intellectual, education-oriented zodiac sign. So we have this thing about sun in the ninth house will really respect education and educators and teachers, and therefore get educated and smart. Sure, if it's in Pisces, that's really highlighted because Pisces is the most educationally oriented sign. Furthermore, if the sun is in the ninth house in Pisces, that means it's the 2nd Lord. And the 2nd house has to do with education. So if the 2nd Lord, Lord of Education, is in the house of educators, then the person's probably smart. Besides this, a very important thing with Albert Einstein is that his 5th Lord, Mars, is exalted and in a Raja Yoga. And that's the Lord of Intellect, the Lord of the 5th house. The 3rd person is Prabhupada. Maybe not as many people know who this person is. This is the founder of the Hare Krishna movement. So he's also a big leader, etc., but he's not the same as Einstein, and he's not the same as Martin Luther King. But what's different? Well, again, his ninth house is different. It's not Capricorn or Pisces, it's Virgo. Virgo has a lot of respect, especially for the way things are supposed to be done. And so if it's with the sun in the ninth house in Virgo, the sun in the ninth house has respect for tradition, right? So that was really one of the key things about Prabhupada. He was a 1960s figure. But he was very different than the rest of the 1960s figures in that he was extremely traditional and really just trying to bring to the modern world exactly what was coming out of the ancient stuff. Not trying to modify it and blend it and make it have the sameness as all the modern stuff. So when I think of Prabhupada with Sun in the 9th house, I think, respects traditions is really a good example of the Sun in the 9th house with respect for tradition. The other thing about him is that he's very anti-sensual. He's very into renunciation and strictness of not non-indulgence. He's very against indulgence. And so his Sun in his 9th house is with a debilitated Venus. So he's got a leadership which is, and a respect for traditions, but the particular style of leadership is very anti-sensual, and the particular type of traditions that he respects are those which are very anti-indulgent. Adding to that, his Sun in his 9th house is the 8th lord. So the traditions that he is a champion of are the mystical traditions. And now Rama, again, I think most people would know who Rama is. Rama is an avatar of Vishnu, who is known as the greatest king, an ideal king. So when, of course, Sun in the 9th house makes sense for a person who's a great leader, because that's the main thing about the Sun in the 9th house. A great leader who's kind of a parental type of a leader. So Rama, Sun in the 9th house, is with an exalted Venus. Prabhupada is with a debilitated Venus. So Rama's nature is not very strict, but it's very generous. And it's very loving. Very, very loving. Very kind leader. Actually, since Ram is an avatar of Vishnu, we would expect this chart to probably be the best out of the 4, right? If you look, he has the exalted 5th lord Mars in the 7th house, just like Einstein did, and it's in Pisces, just like Einstein, so he's very smart as well, like an Einstein. And like a leader working hard for his people, like Martin Luther King. Well, Martin Luther King had Sun in Capricorn as the 4th lord, but Ram has Saturn, the lord of Capricorn, in the 4th house exalted. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. Understanding the Sun in the 10th house begins by understanding the Sun and the 10th house. Let's start off by reviewing quickly the 10th house and what it symbolizes. As you can see, it is the area of sky which is directly overhead. That's the definition of the 10th house. And that physical reality is the reason why the 10th house symbolizes everything that it symbolizes. The area over your head, the open sky, is the most visible part of the sky. So the 10th house has to do with visibility. This is why it's a house of everything that pertains to extroversion or outwardness. So it's a house of masculinity, it's a house of the public, it's a house of society. In turn, this is why the 10th house is the house of fame. How visible are you? How well do people know you? What is your status in society? What is your career? What is your role in society? And finally, this is why it's a house of influence. Being up high, you have a lot of influence on things. You're very noticeable and you have a lot of power. So the 10th house shows us how much influence or how much authority, how much power we have. The open sky is not only visible, it's also quite windy. And this is why the 10th house represents movement and travel. In fact, the 10th house being very windy is not a very permanent place. When you look up in the sky, the things you see right now are not the same things that you'll see in an hour. So the 10th house signifies things which are not stable. It signifies instability. It signifies things that go away, dispersion or evaporation of things. Now, that kind of review that we just did for the 10th house, let's do the same thing for the sun. And then we'll be ready to talk about what the sun symbolizes when it's in this 10th house. The sun is the brightest planet. It has the most light, and that's why it symbolizes the soul, because the soul is the quantum of awareness and light is the agency of awareness. So the sun signifies awareness, light, which means visibility and vision. So it sounds kind of similar with the 10th house, visibility. So it symbolizes very similar things like the public, how extroversive you are, how outward you are, how masculine you are, how confident to go out, how much command or influence you have, how much authority and leadership. The soul is not only the quantum of awareness, but it's also the quantum of identity, because awareness is the focal point or the core of identity. Our identity is formed based on what we become aware of. So the sun represents the self, the seat of the identity. So it has to do with ego and self-esteem. And also it represents the seat or the core, the middle of anything. So it represents centrality and stability. So that's a little bit at odds with the 10th house, isn't it? And finally, the soul also has to do with the life force. The awareness is actually the animating factor. So the sun has to do with animation and vitality, life force. So it's the planet that symbolizes health. So now let's talk about what the sun symbolizes when it's in the 10th house. And the way that you sort that out is by looking for things about both the sun and the 10th house that are very, very similar or very, very diametrically opposite. So we already really have our finger on this pulse. We realize that the 10th house is all about visibility, and so is the sun. Because the sun and the 10th house are both pro-visibility, if you have the sun in the 10th house, the interpretation is very pro-visibility. So what does that exactly mean? It means the person probably has a lot of renown. Their name is known. They're a known person. People know who they are. And that kind of translates into career success, fame or notoriety, etc. And the other thing about visibility, is you remember from going over the sun and the second house, is that it also influences your power or influence over others. So if you have a lot of visibility, it means you're high up. If you're high up, that means you have a lot of power. So sun in the 10th house indicates people that are powerful and therefore confident, assertive. Now, as I said, you want to not only look for where the planet and house are similar, you also want to look if there's anywhere that they're diametrically opposite. And we also have a case of that with the sun in the 10th house, because the sun is all about stability, centrality, and the 10th house is all about instability, wind, dispersion. If you put the two of these on a balance, you'll find the visibility sameness outweighs the stability dissimilarity. Because the visibility sameness is a deeper thing. The sun very deeply signifies light and visibility. And the 10th house, the open sky, very deeply signifies visibility. Whereas the stability thing is a derived symbolism. So the main quality of the sun in the 10th house is positive. It's mostly about the synergy of visibility. But there's a subtext to it which is negative, which is from the instability-stability clash. And the effect of that is that, yes, they have renown, career success, yes, they're assertive and confidence, but very likely they're not the stablest people, so therefore they're probably giving up something in order to gain something else. They're probably giving up or sacrificing something to gain their notoriety or confidence, or their notoriety and confidence might not be very enduring. There is the theory of what the sun in the 10th house represents. It's a very clear, good, simple theory. Let's see how it actually works in some actual birth charts. I have 4 on record with known reliable birth times. We have Sadhguru, Benito Mussolini, Bernard Madoff, and Vincent van Gogh. All 4 of these people have sun in 10th, but slightly different or vastly different conditions affect that sun in the 10th house, and hence you have slightly or vastly different people. So for example, Sadhguru, sun is in the 10th house in Virgo. So there's an intellectual flavor to his authority. There's an intellectual flavor to his leadership. There's a scholarly flavor to it, or a patient, painstaking, detail-oriented flavor to it. If the sun is in Virgo in the 10th house, that means that the sun is the 9th lord. 9th lord in the 10th house. 9th is the house of religion, philosophy, priests, teachers, gurus. So his famous, fame-making sun in the 10th house is the 9th lord. So it adds a religious or teachery flavor. Especially in Virgo, it adds like a teachery flavor to what he would be famous for. And on top of that, it's quite close to Mars. Mars is another very masculine planet. It's also going to do well in the 10th house. It's going to enhance this whole thing. Besides that, Mars is the 12th lord and the 5th lord. So the 12th lord is also explaining that it's not like a social type of religiosity that he's renowned for. It's more mystical religiosity. And the 5th lord, Mars being the 5th lord, means that the 5th and the 9th lord are joined as Mars and the sun in the 10th house. 5th and 9th lord joined in favorable conditions in the 10th house is amazingly fortuitous. And then on top of that, they're with Mercury. So Mercury is the 10th lord. So the sun and Mars are in the 10th house with the 10th lord, really accentuating. This sun in the 10th house is really accentuated. It's with another masculine planet, and it's with the 10th lord in the 10th house. And then, if you realize that the 5th lord is Mars and the 9th lord is the sun, and they're both with the 10th lord, then you realize you just got a mega Raja Yoga, which is a yoga which is very compatible with the sun being in the 10th house, because this yoga also confers that same effect of leadership, confidence, authority, etc. So here's a person with an extreme destiny for leadership as an intellectual and a mystical spiritualist. This thing about the instability that's potential with the sun in the 10th house doesn't really come out for him, A, because the sun is in such good conditions here, but B, especially because Mercury is also the 7th lord. The other house which is very unstable besides the 10th is the 7th. And so if you put the 7th lord in the 10th house, you have a synergy of instability. Synergy of instability would be interpreted as really good travel. So all in all, what he has going on in his 10th house is fame as an intellectual spiritualist all over the world, traveling far. His fame is traveling all over the place. However, you still see a hint of instability in that there's a strong break in his life. It's the pre-spiritual era of his life and the spiritual era of his life are quite different. Now, a chart which is less beautiful is Benito Mussolini's, as Benito Mussolini is also a less beautiful person than Sadhguru. He has the sun in the 10th house in Leo, so now that's masculine stuff is becoming the main backbone of the interpretation. He has the sun here with Mercury, similar to Sadhguru, but Sadhguru's Mercury was exalted here, and Sadhguru's Mercury is not combust. Sadhguru's Mercury was the 10th lord, but Mussolini's Mercury is the 8th lord. That leads us to just look at the 8th house, and then all of a sudden we notice that the moon is hemmed by malefics, and the moon is in the 8th house, and that in total he only has three signs occupied by planets, by real planets. So we feel it's a very aggressive masculine chart, violent and subversive. And that's what he becomes famous for. And his chart is more about that aggressive kind of confidence, masculine assertiveness. And the instability issue in Mussolini's chart has no counterbalance. So it's a very unstable fame that he had. A rise to fame and then a immediate decline to infamy. Third chart with the sun in the 10th house is Bernard Madoff, the financial thief. Very funny chart, really. The sun is in the 10th house. Okay, that just directs our attention to the 10th house. There's a lot of things in the 10th house. What's really more in the 10th house than the sun is Ketu and Venus, because they are at 27 to 30 degrees and his ascendant is at 29. So the closest thing to the cusp of the 10th house, cusp being the most essential point, which is 29 degrees, is Venus and Ketu. And that's very funny. That is Bernard Madoff. It's Venus Ketu in the 10th house. Ketu is very deceptive, and Venus signifies wealth, and the 10th house is very prominent and high up and also very fleeting. And Ketu in the 10th house, with the sun in the 10th house and the moon, it really highlights the instability potential of the sun in the 10th house. Finally, let's take a look at Vincent van Gogh. This is a very interesting chart. So his sun is in the 10th house in Aries, so it's exalted. So he should be very, very famous. And in fact, maybe we could say that he's the most famous of all the 4 people that we have up here. Now, his 10th lord is in the 9th house with an exalted Venus. Exalted Venus means very artistic. So very famous in an artistic capacity. The sun is again with Mercury, as it usually is anywhere. It might seem odd that it's with Mercury so often, but it's not odd. Because Mercury never really gets more than 30 degrees away from the sun. The sun again in the 10th house is with Mercury. And in fact, just like Bernard Madoff had the sun in the 10th house, but really it's more about Ketu in the 10th house and Venus because they're closer to the ascendant degree. Similarly with Van Gogh, he has sun in the 10th house, but the real item in the 10th house, the dominant factor in the 10th house is Mercury because of how close it is to the sensitive degree of the 10th house. So Mercury is his 3rd lord. First of all, Mercury is talented, dexterous, and expressive and intellectual. And second of all, it's the 3rd lord, which has to do with hands. So the combination of all these things, that the 10th lord being conjoined to the exalted Venus, with the sun in the 10th house exalted, with Mercury as the dominant player in the 10th house as the 3rd lord, you find a person that's very famous for their artistic hands. But Van Gogh, as much as he's famous for being an amazing painter, he's also famous for being a very depressive person. And so you can also very easily see that in his chart. Very unstable. The instability that's potential from the sun in the 10th house really is highlighted in this chart. Why? Because his first lord, Moon, is very, very closely conjoined Ketu, a node, in the 6th house with the 6th lord. So that's very unhappy to be in. 6th house is not a happy place. The 6th lord is not a happy lord. Ketu is not a stable planet. It's an unstable planet. Moon is not a stable planet. So Moon is his first lord with Ketu. That really highlights the instability. And being in the 6th house with the 6th lord, it's not very happy. And then on top of that, he has Saturn in the 11th house at 16 degrees when the ascendant is at 21. So Saturn is very strongly aspecting the ascendant from the 11th house. He's not a very happy person. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcarrot.com/R2. Thank you so much. Understanding the sun in the 11th house begins, or should begin, with a really brief but very important review of what the 11th house is and what the sun is. So here you can see a depiction of physically what the 11th house is. It's the slice of sky that's above your head, but slightly to the east. This physical fact is the basis for all of the things that the 11th house symbolizes. The upper part of the sky symbolizes society, and the eastern part of the sky symbolizes the self. So the 11th house symbolizes the way we benefit from what society has to offer. So what does society have to offer? Basically, there's three categories of benefits. There's social benefits, cultural benefits, and economic opportunities. So as for social benefits, now you probably understand why the 11th house is the house of friends. What kind of friends are those? Those are just the people that are in your town, the people that are at your school, the people that you do things with. They're not your best friends for life or any of that. They're just people that you party with, people that you play with. And this is also why the 11th house describes what kind of a social network you have, how many contacts you have, and who you could call if you want to party, or if you want to get some kind of an advantage or an opportunity. Do you know somebody? That's described by the 11th house. As for cultural benefits, this is why the 11th is the house of arts. How do we benefit from society culturally? Well, that's all the dance and music and theater and cinema and everything. And so this is why it's an extremely important house for entertainment and entertainers. This is why it represents all the talent that's involved in producing art. And also, what most people don't often think about is the talent that is required to even experience or appreciate art. As for the economic opportunities that society provides us with, it provides you with a market. So this is why the 11th is the house of income and profit and money and wealth and things that you can party with, things that you can enjoy, things that are beautiful and artistic. Wealth, money, profit, income. What is wealth really? Wealth is a pleasurable thing. And so the bottom line of the 11th house of all this stuff of friends, parties, arts, talent, taste, income, money, it's all about this is how you enjoy life. What is the sun going to symbolize when it's here in this environment of the 11th house? To know that, just take 2 minutes and review what the sun is all about. The sun is the brightest planet, and thus it symbolizes the soul, because the soul is the source of our consciousness or awareness, and light is symbolic of awareness. Light enables awareness, right? So the sun represents light, and hence it has to do with vision and visibility. This is why the sun represents how visible or public you are. And that's why the sun is a male planet. Something which makes itself visible is male. The male organ is visible. The male nature is extroversive, demonstrative, loud. The sun represents maleness, and it represents the extroverse, the external world, the public, society, etc. So the sun represents how visible you are, and it also represents how much vision you have. So a person who has a vision knows where the goal is and directs people how to get to it, and orders themselves and gets to their goal. They have a sense of leadership, command. So the sun represents command, authorities, people who set the direction, people who set the standard and the path. The kings, the rulers, the leaders, the bosses, the dads. It's particularly a male kind of authority, hence dad. Now, as we said, the sun represents the soul, and the soul is awareness, but the awareness is the core around which we build identity. We build our identity based on what we're aware of. I'm aware of being a human, so that influences my identity. I'm aware of living in Japan. The identity is built based on what you're aware of, so the sun also represents identity, and that whole concept of the central thing around which other things are built. So it represents the self, and it represents the core, or the central figure. And also the awareness within a life form is the animator of the life form, and so the sun represents animus, or life force, and that's why it has to do with health. Now, we have completed successfully our review of the sun and the 11th house, and it is high time for us to, as they say on YouTube, jump right into it and talk about the sun and the 11th house, because God knows nobody on YouTube wants to wait for anything. But if you don't wait a little bit, then you might jump into things unprepared. So I hope you didn't mind waiting through that review. Now, sun in the 11th house, how do you figure out what it means? You put them side by side, and you think about where they are on the same page, because that can be where they connect. So, for example, when we talked about the sun, we said it was a visible planet. It's highly visible, so it's highly public, and public means the society and everything. And when we talked about the 11th house, we mentioned it was high up in the sky, so it has to do with society and the benefits we get from society. So the 11th house is a social place, and the sun is a outward or visible planet. So those two concepts fit together in a complementary way. So that's one thing that we would want to explore or think about when we're trying to get a feeling or an intuition for what the sun symbolizes when it's in the 11th house. Another thing is that the sun is very commandy. It's leadershipy. It's the authority on anything. And the 11th house has something that fits with that, because the 11th house is so talented. So those two things kind of fit together also in an interesting way, and that's a subtext of another thing that we should think about and try to get an intuition for when trying to get the pulse of what the sun symbolizes in the 11th house. And there's one other thing which is interesting about the sun. The sun represents the self, but the 11th house, it represents friends. So you might think that this is a way that the sun and the 11th house fit together in a non-complementary way. Sun is self, and 11th house is friends. But actually remember that the type of friend in the 11th house isn't the friend for whom we sacrifice. Or it's not the type of friend that sacrifices for us. It's the type of friend that just benefits from us, and it's the type of friend that we benefit from. So it's really not incompatible that the sun is self-oriented and that the 11th house is friends-oriented. So take that off the list. That's not something that we have to think about. If it was, then we would have to have a negative intuition about the sun in the 11th house on that topic of self-interfering with friends. But because the type of friend in the 11th house is actually compatible with selfishness, then therefore this isn't an issue. So now what you want to do is kind of visualize or imagine how these things fit together and what it means. So for example, the sun being public and the 11th house being social, it means that these people are very good with being social. So what does that mean? Think about it, intuit it, get a feeling for it. We have it with the sun in the 11th house. So the people with the sun in the 11th house, they like to enjoy their friends. They like to enjoy wealth. They like to enjoy society. They like to show themselves. They like to be out there. And they like to even be enjoyable They like to be enjoyed by others. So they're enjoyers. The sun in the 11th house is an enjoyer. They like the world, and they like to interact with the world, and they like to enjoy it, and they like to be enjoyed by it. And hence, they like enjoyable stuff, and they're good with enjoyable stuff. So, like, they're probably good looking. They're probably attractive in some other way as well, like they're qualified or talented or artistic. And quite likely, they have a lot of enjoyable stuff. And so we can say they're wealthy or they have money. You see, this is how you get an intuition about what the sun in the 11th house signifies and how you fructify that intuition into some concrete imagery that you can then take. This concrete imagery is still abstract because it's just the sun in the 11th house. Maybe you watching this video have the sun in the 11th house, but I don't know what sign it's in. I don't know what other planets it's with. I don't know what lord it is. I don't know what aspects it's getting. But I do know about the sun in the 11th house, and what I can tell you in this video is about the sun in the 11th house. And you can take that imagery, and then you have to get an intuition about how that imagery sits with the rest of the stuff that's affecting your sun in the 11th house. And I'll show you how to do that in 4 charts in this video, so you get a hang of how it works. But the other thing about sun in the 11th house is we said that the sun was the authority and that the 11th house is a very talented person. So it's not exactly a match, but the 11th house, in other words, produces a person who is very qualified to be a leader. And the sun indicates a person who is very eager to be a leader. The sun is eager to be a leader, and the 11th house is very capable of being the best at things. So you can see how they're on the same page. And the implication of it, therefore, or the interpretation of the sun in the 11th house is the people are talented. They're sophisticated. They're artistic. They're leaders in that field of enjoyment. They're leaders in the field of creativity and art, etc. So like I promised, we will now look at 4 charts that have the sun in the 11th house to see how this concept of the sun in the 11th house actually works in an actual person. We're going to look at Jim Morrison, Marilyn Monroe, Ernest Hemingway, and Donald Trump. Now, I didn't cherry pick these people. These are just, I have a small database of people with known birth times, and these are the people that have the sun in the 11th house in my small database. Talented, sophisticated, artistic, they really like to enjoy. Donald Trump, he's like the guy that wants all the money in the world. He wants wealth. Ernest Hemingway, a very talented writer. Marilyn Monroe, super sex symbol. Jim Morrison, super sex symbol, an artist. You might be thinking, how come I'm not like Jim Morrison or Marilyn Monroe? That's from the rest of the chart. So now let's look in detail. Jim Morrison's sun in the 11th house in Sagittarius, the most philosophical of all the zodiac signs. If you're a Jim Morrison fan, then you probably recognize that phrase. Yeah, there it is. That's what he's talking about, sun in Sagittarius, and it's in his 11th house. So he's got this nature of being kind of philosophical or something. He's a philosophical artist, this psychedelic type of thing. But that's how maybe he thinks about himself, but most of this Jim Morrison is just sex appeal. So what is really going on with his chart? Well, his sun, if it's in Sagittarius in the 11th house, that means Leo is the 7th house. So his sun in Sagittarius, 11th house, is the 7th lord. The 7th lord in the 11th house is very sexy because the 7th house has to do with sex and intercourse, and the 11th house is pleasure. So the sun in the 7th house makes you capable and kind of outstanding and enjoying, and it makes you have a good hunger for enjoying, not shy about enjoying, etc. And then as the 7th lord in the 11th house, that really makes it quite a sexual flavor to this. And now the 11th house Sagittarius belongs to Jupiter. Sagittarius belongs to Jupiter. So where's Jupiter in this chart? Oh my, Jupiter is in his 7th house. So his 7th lord is in the 11th, and his 11th lord is in the 7th, so he has an exchange or circuit, parivartana, between 11 and 7. There's your sex symbol. Taking our eye off the sun just to look briefly on the rest of the chart for other things like that support stuff about the sun in the 11th house. That's what you want to do. If a person has a sun in the 11th house, but nothing else in the chart is artistic or hedonistic or money-oriented, then none of this potential of the sun in the 11th house got any help. So you would be sort of amiss to expect that sun in the 11th interpretations would be a very accurate, direct description of the person. But in Marson's case, his moon is exalted in the 4th house. So that's very supportive of what the sun in the 11th house represents. The moon in the exalted in the 4th house is very artistic and also very sexy. And on top of that, look at his 5th house for creativity. Also, always look at the 5th and 3rd house for creativity. His 5th house has the 3rd lord in it. That's very important for creativity. And it also has the 1st lord in it. So that 3rd lord Mars is also the 10th. So that means the 1st lord Saturn and the 10th lord Mars join in the 5th house. So the 1st lord self and 10th lord career joining in the house of creativity. And when the 1st and 10th lords join, that's called Raja Yoga. So that's very supportive of anything having to do with the sun, to have a Raja Yoga. So here you see Jim Morrison in the full picture. A really creative artist that's somewhat psychedelic, somewhat philosophical, but mostly just very, very sexy. Now let's have a look at Marilyn Monroe, the Great. So again, sun is in the 11th house, just like Marson. But in her case, it's in Gemini. So that means she has the 1st lord in the 11th house. The sun in the 11th house is the 1st lord. The 1st lord is your physical self, your body. So the sun in the 11th house had all this potential for beauty, etc. Well, if it's the 1st lord, then that's what it's really going to take advantage of. That's really going to be highlighted. And sure enough, Marilyn Monroe is physically beautiful. On top of that, it's with Mercury. Mercury is extremely beautiful. It's very refined and well-defined. So there's another source of beauty. And on top of that, it's in Gemini. Gemini is very refined. Gemini is very delicate and detailed and beautiful. So the sun in the 11th house for anybody has the potential to indicate beauty. But if it's in the 11th house, Gemini is the 1st lord with the 11th lord, Mercury, then it's very, very, very beautiful. On top of that, looking elsewhere to see if there's anything that supports this, the moon is right across from her ascendant. So the moon, the most beautiful planet, is aspecting the ascendant, the point that defines the 1st house, and therefore most directly influences how you look. So that's super supportive. There's another source of beauty. And then Jupiter is also kicking its aspect into here too, as well as aspecting the sun and Mercury in the 11th house. Jupiter is the 8th lord. The 8th lord is sex, reproduction, sexiness, sex drive. Jupiter is the planet of reproduction and children. So having the 1st lord in the 11th house with the 11th lord in Gemini with Mercury while aspected by Jupiter, the 8th lord, that is very beautiful in a sexy way. And on top of that, she's got Mars in the 8th house in Pisces. This is extremely sexy. And that Mars is, by its square aspect, aspecting those 2 planets in the 11th house as well. So this is Marilyn Monroe to a T. And this is why somebody else with the sun in the 11th house isn't Marilyn Monroe. So now Ernest Hemingway, another one with the sun in the 11th house, who's a very different person Sure, they have stuff in common, but he's quite different from Morrison or Marilyn. So, yeah, first thing you notice about his sun in the 11th house is that it's right next to Venus. So maybe he's beautiful, or maybe he's an artist. And if it's in Cancer, that means that Leo is the 12th house. So it's not really supporting the concept of him being beautiful. Rather, it's supporting the concept of him being quiet, being secluded. Sun in Cancer supports the idea of being quiet or secluded, not dominant, not seen. Sun is the 12th lord in the 11th house, also secluded, yet Sun in the 11th house is dominant and expressive. So we're seeing a more complicated picture. It's a person that's outgoing but yet secluded. Sometimes this happens when you read a chart. It's very confusing for a while. Now, if we look further, I would probably just look next at the 11th lord. Where did it go? If I'm interested in figuring out what the sun in the 11th house is all about, I would look at the 11th lord. So look where it went. It went to the 5th house. And it went to 10 degrees of the 5th house, which means it's very influential because the ascendant is 8. So that means that the 11th house is very, very blessed because its own lord is aspecting it very, very strongly from a place, the 5th house, that's very compatible with the 11th house themes, which is creativity. So his 11th house is really enhanced by creative talent. So what's this showing us now is here's an artist. That's what this Venus is all about. Sure, the guy's good looking, but mostly he's artist. A very talented artist, and he probably does his art in a studio somewhere. Or he probably is not a performing artist because the sun is in Cancer as the 12th lord. You know, this is how you narrow down the possibilities of an interpretation. Then I would next always just, if I run out of options, I would just look at the 1st house. What is it? It's Virgo. Virgo is pretty wordy. Virgo is very good with words. And sure enough, what planet is in Virgo is his 3rd lord. So the 3rd lord has the potential to give skill in writing. And if it's in Virgo, then that's what it does. It gives the potential to use words, especially writing. And if it's in the 1st house, then it's quite an important part of the person's chart. And remember what I said about the 3rd and the 5th houses? You want to get them together somehow if you really want to know that a person is artistically talented. Well, his 3rd lord is Mars, and it's exactly square to Saturn. In exactly the right position, where Saturn is 90 degrees from Mars, and Mars is 270 degrees from Saturn. So they have a perfect mutual aspect on each other, the 5th and the 7th lord. Now we can be totally sure. This is not a model. I'm sure he's a good-looking person. He's an artist who works in seclusion with his hands. And if you have to make a guess whether he's a painter or a writer, you would go. It could go either way. But you would probably define him as a writer because of the Virgo ascendant. And then you'd be right on the money. Finally, we have this fellow, Donald Trump, who kind of maybe seems different than the other ones. He's not a sexy guy like Jim Morrison. He's not appealing, really. I guess he is appealing in some way. Very, very appealing. He has a huge following, doesn't he? But he's not like sexually appealing or artistically appealing, so it doesn't seem to fit with Marilyn Monroe types or Jim Morrison types. I guess he kind of is like an Ernest Hemingway in being this bold, masculine type of person, but he's very unartistic. So what is the sun in the 11th house with Trump? Well, remember, it's giving you you're an enjoyer. Sun in the 11th house means enjoyer. That's what all these people have in common. And Trump is the epitome of an enjoyer. He's just like over the top hedonist. So if you look at his chart, it's kind of shockingly similar to Monroe's in a sense. He's got the same ascendant, Leo. So his sun in the 11th house is in Gemini as the first lord. So what does that mean? He should be as beautiful as Marilyn Monroe? Well, no. Is it the same as Marilyn Monroe's? Use your head. Marilyn Monroe has all kinds of things going on in her chart to make a person beautiful. Trump has this one thing. So maybe he has fancy hair or something. He has this one thing that it's the first lord in Gemini in the 11th house. But it's with Rahu. Is Rahu a good-looking planet? No. And where are his good-looking planets? They're tucked away in the 12th or the 3rd. So it's not really that he's a beautiful person. Rather, his sun is with Rahu, very close to Rahu. It's actually in an eclipse, so it's very, very, very Rahuized sun. What is Rahu? Rahu is avariciousness. Rahu is hunger. And is there something about the sun in the 11th house that can get on the same page with avariciousness and hunger? Yes. The sun in the 11th house is an enjoyer. It loves to enjoy. It's a masculine force in the house of pleasures. So it loves it. It wants to enjoy that house. And now Trump has it with Rahu. So he's total avaricious. Very, very hungry for money. Very, very hungry for power. Very, very hungry for items of wealth and profit and so forth. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much. Okay, the sun in the 12th house. We want to understand it. So let's take 2 seconds and understand what the 12th house symbolizes and what the sun symbolizes. Then we can put them together and we can talk about the sun in the 12th house and look at some charts of actual people who have the sun in the 12th house. Angelina Jolie, Frida Kahlo, O.J. Simpson, and Joe Biden. So this is what the 12th house physically is. It's the area of the sky that's directly above the eastern horizon. The area that's just above the land is the area that has the weather in it, the wind, the rain, the clouds, etc. So the houses that are above the horizon directly symbolize things that you rode, the symbolism of the house beneath it. So the 12th house, the foundation of everything that it symbolizes, is that it erodes or subtracts from, detracts from anything that the first house symbolizes. What does the first house symbolize? Well, it's the sunrise. Right? So it symbolizes things that are visible and symbolizes things coming into being or being born. And therefore it symbolizes the thing which has come into being, the person whose chart it is. So it symbolizes the self. So the first house symbolizes visibility, birth, and self, and therefore the 12th house erodes or detracts from those three things. Now you understand the anatomy and the biology of the 12th house. You can derive a lot of very specific things about the 12th house now, very reliably and confidently. For example, the 12th is the house of unreal things because it's erosive of visibility. So that's why the 12th house has to do with things that are amorphous, things that are abstract, difficult to hold, difficult to grasp. It has to do with things that are fantastic, it has to do with fantasies and dreams. And it has to do with spiritual things, things that are not bound by physicality or limits. This is also why it is the house of unknown things. It's erosive of visibility, so it represents things that you don't see. So it represents things that you don't know. That's why it has to do with things that are far away, things that are alien, from another world, from another country, from another culture, things that are exotic. And then, because the sunrise represents the birth, and the area of sky above the east will erode the concept of the symbolism of birth. So it's not exactly that the 12th house symbolizes death, but it symbolizes the subtraction of what we gain from birth. So it's like draining. It's the house of drain. It's the house of aging. It's the house of becoming tired and fatigued, losing energy and heading towards your expiration. This is also why it is the house of spending money. Because in general, it's about being drained of things, losing things, having things become evaporated from you. Finally, the eastern horizon represents the self, so the 12th house represents things that are erosive of the self. That's why it's the house of humility. Subtracting yourself. Getting out of the way, getting out of the spotlight. So it's a house which is very isolated. It has a lot of solitude to it, has a lot of quiet to it. And on the flip side, this is the house of enemies because it's antithetical to self. So the people who are antithetical to you are your enemies. But it's not like enemies that are barbarically attacking you. It's more like the enemies who are the naysayers, the detractors, the critics, the people that are depressive and discourage you. That is what you need to know about the 12th house before you can understand the sun in the 12th house. Now the only thing that remains is to just quickly get a review about what the sun represents. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the sun is the brightest planet. So the sun symbolizes the soul, which symbolizes awareness, which is symbolized by light. Light enables vision and visibility, and that's what the sun is all about. That's why it is the planet of fame or public renown, because it's the planet of visibility. So it has to do with how well known you become, and it also has to do with how much you make yourself visible, how extroversive you are, and also how masculine you are. Also, since the sun represents light, it represents vision. Vision means you know which way to go and you direct other people to go in a certain direction. So the sun's nature is to symbolize people who give commands, who give directions, who give orders, who are the authority figures. That's why it represents people like your dad and the boss and the king, etc. Now let's go back to the basic thing that the sun signifies: awareness. Awareness is the nucleus around which we assemble the electrons of the specifics of our identity. So the sun signifies the specifics of your identity. That's why it's the planet of self, and has to do with your ego and your self-esteem. And this is why the planet has to do with centrality, or the nucleus of things, the center of things, the anchor points of things, the centrality, the stability, the reliability of things. Finally, the soul, or the awareness, is the animator of a life form. And so the sun represents the animation and the vitality that together constitute health, good health. So now indeed we understand both the sun and the 12th house. Now, how should we figure out what the sun represents when it's in the 12th house? All you need to do really is put the two things side by side and think about where they're talking about the same thing. For example, the sun is definitely talking about being bright, which means being visible. Whereas the 12th house is erosive of visibility. So they're talking about the same thing. The sun is talking about visibility and the 12th house is talking about visibility, but they're talking about it in opposite ways. The sun is pro-visibility and the 12th house is anti-visibility. So there we've identified an important thing about the sun in the 12th house that needs to be a key part of our interpretation of it. Another thing is that the sun signifies your identity and your ego and your self-confidence, but the 12th house is erosive of all those things. It's erosive of self, and it symbolizes humility. So again, they're both talking about the same thing, self, but the sun is talking pro-self and the 12th house is talking anti-self. So we're going to have to interpret that clash between the symbolism. And thirdly and finally, the sun represents health, right? Vitality, but the 12th house represents fatigue. So they're both talking about the same thing, your energy levels, but the sun is increasing your energy level and the 12th house is decreasing it. So we have three important clashes between the sun and the 12th house. Pro-visibility versus anti-visibility, ego versus humility, and vitality versus fatigue. Now that we've filtered out these three key things about the sun in the 12th house, we can use our imagination, really, to figure out some specific words that would describe the effects of these three things. For example, how would you describe the effect of a clash between pro-visibility versus anti-visibility? Well, why don't we say difficulty becoming recognized, because the visibility is clashing with the invisibility. So maybe it's a real struggle to get any visibility, and conversely, maybe it's a real struggle to get any privacy. But most likely the planet is becoming frustrated by the resources that are available in the house. So most likely it's difficulty becoming recognized. So unrecognizability, no fame, no recognition. How would you come up with some words to describe the effects of the clash between ego and humility? Well, something along the lines of problems with self-esteem, self-doubt. Another thing that comes to mind is the humble being might be clashing with the authority figure, the ego being. The ego being, the authority figure, might be clashing with the humble being. So another way to put this into words as a concrete statement about the sun in the 12th house is that this person doesn't go well with the boss. Probably the boss is abusive towards them. The authority figures may mistreat them or exploit them. And or they just very distrustful of such figures. Thirdly and finally, how would you give words to express this clash between vitality and fatigue? There's a problem with vitality. The planet of vitality is getting frustrated in the house of fatigue. So the source of vitality is diminished. So what does that look like? Kind of weak. Kind of easily gets ill or persistently ill. Feels lazy, feels lethargic, doesn't feel enthusiastic or even ambitious about things. So this is not a bright picture, is it? Sun in the 12th house. And I'm sure most of the people that come to watch the Sun in the 12th house video probably have the Sun in the 12th house and probably right now are wishing you didn't come to see the video. So unsubscribe and click the unlike button. But wait, let's be realistic about this. We have 4 charts that we're about to examine of people who are famous and successful with the Sun in the 12th house. So either this interpretation is totally wrong, or the system of astrology is slightly more sophisticated than only tunnel visioning on one thing in your chart. So let's ask ourselves the question. This guy Vic, who's making this video, he found 4 famous people who have the Sun in the 12th house. How did he manage to do that if the interpretation of the Sun in the 12th house is so negative? Somehow or another, the other things in the chart that can also indicate fame and confidence and health and energy and ambition must be stronger than the Sun in the 12th house. And that Sun in the 12th house also must not be too terribly situated there. It must be there in a pretty good condition. Now let's actually look at these charts and see if that is not indeed what we find. So like I said at the beginning, we've got Angelina Jolie, Frida Kahlo, O.J. Simpson, and Joseph Biden, President Biden. So we think that something in these charts must be offsetting the lack of recognition indicated by the sun in the 12th house. What could do that? The strongest thing that could do that would be the first house and the 10th house. So what we're most likely going to find in these charts is that they have a fantastic first and 10th house. And hence the sun in the 12th house cannot manifest its potential for decreasing the fame. Though, of course, it has an effect upon their character, which you can see by thinking about these 4 people on the list. So let's specifically look at Angelina's chart first. What does she have going on? Well, she says she has a first lord in Raja Yoga with the 10th lord in the 9th house. Whoa. Let's check and see if she's right. So her first house is Cancer. That means her first lord is the moon. Ooh, the first lord is in the 10th house. That's contradicting the interpretation of the sun in the 12th. Because the first lord in the 10th house means a person who makes themselves very visible and is very recognizable. It's her first lord in the 10th house, and whose company is it in? Well, on one side it has Jupiter, and on the other side it has Mars. Which lord is Mars? Mars is the 10th lord and the 5th lord. So what happened is the first lord, the lord of a trine, joined with the 10th lord, the lord of a quadrant, in a quadrant. That's a very, very strong Raja Yoga, especially because the lord of the 10th house is also the lord of a trine. And the lord of the first house is also the lord of the quadrant, so it's a double Raja Yoga in a quadrant. So she has fabulous Raja Yoga between her first lord Moon and her 10th and 5th lord Mars in her 10th house. Also, that same first lord is with Jupiter, who's the 9th lord. And that's another Raja Yoga. She has something else to say too. She says that her 10th lord is in another Raja Yoga because it's in a mutual aspect with Saturn. So that means that the lord of a trine, the 5th house, Mars, is in a mutual relationship with the lord of a quadrant, the 7th lord, Saturn. And that Raja Yoga is where are the planets forming that Raja Yoga? In the 1st house and the 10th house. She also says that, I do kind of relate to this interpretation because I do kind of clash with authority figures, especially growing up. And sure enough, her second lord is the sun, right? The sun is the second lord. The sun in the 12th house didn't really get a chance to manifest its potential to diminish her fame, but it does manifest some of its potential to diminish her self-worth via lack of support from the family. Finally, the last thing that she wants to say about her chart here is that her 12th lord is domicile after all. Her 12th lord is in the 12th house. So that means the 12th house itself isn't in an undignified condition. It's in a dignified condition, and when things are in dignified conditions, they don't display bad versions of their traits. So to sum up Angelina's chart, Sun is in the 12th house, but the 12th house is dignified. And she's got 91 million Raja Yogas going on. So there's no way that the Sun in the 12th house is going to actually have an effect of making her unknown. She's going to be quite known, but she's going to have a history of in her formative years having some self-doubt and low self-esteem. The second chart here, Frida Kahlo, the great painter. What's going on in her chart? What does she have to say about her chart? She says, I also have a first lord in Raja Yoga, and it's with the 5th lord. And guess what? My 5th lord is exalted. So look, let's see if she's right. Her first house is Leo. That means that her first lord is the sun, because the sun owns Leo. And look, find the sun on this chart. It's up there in Cancer in the 12th house, like we said. And who's it with? It's with Jupiter. And what houses does Jupiter own? Jupiter owns the 5th. So there you go. You have the same thing. The lord of the first house, which is a quadrant, combines with the lord of the 5th house, which is a trine. And when you combine the lord of a quadrant and a trine, you get something very good called a Raja Yoga, which makes you very renowned and knowable, famous, recognizable. And it's with her fifth lord who's exalted. So it's likely going to have to do with fifth housey things that she becomes known for, which is creativity, expression. Additionally, her fifth lord, she says, is in another Raja Yoga. It's in a Raja Yoga with the fourth and ninth lord, Mars, who is also exalted. So her exalted fifth lord, Jupiter, is in a mutual aspect with her exalted fourth lord, Mars. So that fifth house is really wonderful and gets what's right next to that. She also wants us to note that her 10th house is pretty good too. Because not only is the 10th lord in the 11th, which is good for an artist, but also her 10th house has an exalted planet. That exalted planet is the moon, which is extremely creative and artistic, and also that moon is the lord of Cancer, and Cancer is the 12th house. So just like Angelina, her 12th house is dignified by virtue of the lord having a high dignity. Hence, even without these Raja Yogas, the sun in a dignified 12th house is not going to give a very painful version of its baseline theoretical interpretation. There's 3 exalted planets in one chart. So she's got exalted moon, exalted Mars, and exalted Jupiter. So it's pretty hard to bring down a chart. There's 3 exalted planets in it. Now, how about Mr. O.J. Simpson? Let's see, what does he have to say about his own chart? He says, yo, I also have the first lord in a Raja Yoga with my 10th lord. So don't think I'm not famous. The sun in the 12th house is actually the first lord in a Raja Yoga. So how can anybody in their right mind confidently say that the sun in his 12th house represents insignificance? Even though theoretically the sun in the 12th house represents insignificance. But what I want to tell O.J. Simpson is, unfortunately for you, that's about it, buddy. That's all you really got there in this chart. There's a couple of things that indicate that you are a good fighter and you like to compete and so forth. So you're a good athlete and so on. You're strong and all that. There's a lot of that in your chart, but nothing else really showing you to be a great person. And hence, if you think about O.J. Simpson, he really kind of is a good example of the clash between pro-visibility from the sun and anti-visibility from the 12th house, in the sense of here's a person who became very famous and then very infamous. And now finally, having a look at Joe Biden, he says, I got something better than a Raja Yoga. My first lord is exalted, and my first lord's lord is exalted. That's a very good yoga. Jupiter is his first lord. Where's Jupiter? Oh no, it's in the 8th house. Yeah, and it's exalted in the 8th house. In this other kind of yoga called Adi Yoga, which makes a person very strong and dominant. And so if Jupiter is exalted, it means it's in Cancer. And so Cancer belongs to the moon. Where's the moon? The moon is over there in Taurus. Taurus makes the moon exalted. So indeed, here's a person with the sun in the 12th house. So you think he has a problem with self-esteem, let's say. And also a problem with visibility. Nobody knows this person. But his first house is just doing great. Because his first lord is exalted, and even the lord of the first lord is exalted. So how likely is it that he has problems with self-esteem? If you probably look at his life and you know he's a stutterer and he has self-doubt, etc. It's not that it just goes away and disappears. The sun is still in his 12th house. But it doesn't dominate over these other things that are even more important. He also tells us that he's also got Raja Yogas to boot. So he's got his 10th lord in Raja Yoga, just in case you're thinking, well, it's only his first lord, so maybe he should be pretty healthy and pretty self-confident, but maybe not very well known. Good. Now you're thinking, because you want the 10th house to really give the well-knownness. Well, his 10th lord is in a Raja Yoga with the 9th lord and the 5th lord. So his 10th house is Virgo. Virgo belongs to Mercury. His Mercury is right there, right next to his sun in the 12th house. And the sun is the lord of what house if Sagittarius rises? Sun owns Leo. Leo is the 9th sign from Sagittarius. So the sun is the 9th lord if Sagittarius rises. Moreover, look on the other side of Mercury. On the other side of Mercury is Mars. It's the 5th lord. So his 10th lord, the lord of the quadrant, is conjoined to Mars, the lord of the trine, and the sun, a lord of the other trine. So again, you have a mega Raj Yoga for the 10th lord. So his first house is doing great, and his 10th house is doing great, and his 12th house is doing great, which is important because the dignity of the 12th house is important for interpreting any planet that's in the 12th house. Why is his 12th house doing great? Because the 12th lord is in it. Whenever the lord occupies the house, that's domicile, and that makes the house dignified. If you want to actually have my interpretations for all of your placements in your chart, you can go to my website and order that from the charts page. It's victorcara.com/R2. Thank you so much.